morning and welcome to the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Jennifer Homendy and I'm honored to serve as chair of the NTSB. With me today are my board colleagues, Member Bruce Landsberg, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today's meeting is open to the public in accordance with the government and the Sunshine Act. We're here to discuss a crude oil release from an underwater pipeline that occurred on October 1st of 2021 in San Pedro Bay near Huntington Beach, California. In total, an estimated 588 barrels, or nearly 25,000 gallons of crude oil was released from the pipeline. Damage, including cleanup costs, was estimated at around $160 million. And although there were no human injuries, there most certainly was injury to the environment and to the wildlife and their habitats. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the oil spill impacted ocean waters, rocky intertidal habitats, subtidal habitats, sandy beaches, and sensitive marsh habitats, as well as the fish, birds, invertebrates, and marine mammals that inhabit those areas. During the response, a total of 116 dead birds were recovered, and more than 30 live oiled birds were collected and rehabilitated. Among these birds, several threatened western snowy plovers were treated and released. Marine mammal experts were also dispatched to respond to animal strandings. The spill also closed multiple beaches and harbors, affected the well-known Pacific Air Show, and impacted recreational and commercial fishing. I should mention that right before Thanksgiving, another pipeline ruptured, releasing 1.1 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, and that's gotten barely any attention. Yet the impact to the environment and to commercial fishing in Louisiana is substantial. Now, each board member has studied the draft report and met individually with the investigative team. This is the first time we've gathered as a board to discuss the report. In a moment, NTSB staff will present the pertinent facts and analysis and summarize their findings in detail. After their presentations, board members will question staff on the key safety issues uncovered during the investigation. These include weather, anchor dragging, and damage to the pipeline, anchorage location, hazard awareness, and notification of damage to the pipeline operator, response by pipeline controllers to leak alarms, and issues related to alcohol and other drug testing and fatigue. Staff will then propose the relevant findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for board consideration. Following the incorporation of any amendments voted on today, the final report will be available on our website in a few weeks. The public docket for this investigation was released on March 31st and contains over 4,000 pages of additional relevant material. It's available on our website at ntsb.gov. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the United States Coast Guard, and in particular, U.S. Coast Guard Sector Los Angeles, Long Beach, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Amplify Energy Corporation, MSC Mediterranean Shipping Company, and V-Ships Greece Limited for their collaboration with us on scene and their role as parties to our investigation. While parties are not part of the analysis, they are crucial in helping us develop the facts around an investigation. I'd also like to acknowledge the following organizations for their role in the response and for working with us over the course of our investigation. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, NOAA, the Marine Exchange of Southern California, the Vessel Traffic Service Los Angeles, Long Beach, the U.S. Geological Survey, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and local law enforcement. I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce members of the NTSB team participating in today's meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Homendy. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all their electronic devices at this time. I'll now introduce staff for today's meeting. Unless otherwise noted, staff are from the Office of Marine Safety. Morgan Terrell, Director for the Office of Marine Safety. Michael Hiller, Deputy Director for the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. Drew Ellers, Investigator in Charge. Mike Meadows, Materials Engineer from the Office of Research and Engineering. Kim West, Pipeline Group Chair from the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations. Paul Suffern, Meteorologist from the Office of Aviation Safety. Rebecca Martini, Technical Writer-Editor for the report. Barbara Check, Director from the Office of Research and Engineering. William McMurray, General Counsel for the NTSB. Catherine Catania, Deputy Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Eric Stolzenberg, Deputy Director for the Office of Marine Safety. Liam LaRue, Chief of Investigations. Rob Jones, Deputy Chief of Investigations. Amy Terone, Chief of Product Development. Sean Lynham, Chief Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Investigations from the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Material Investigations. Sarah Lyons, Chief of the Pipeline Investigations Branch from the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Material Investigations. Mike Badinsky, Chief of the Materials Laboratory for the Office of Research and Engineering. And Scott Rainey, Safety Recommendations Specialist from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Andrew Ellers. Mr. Ellers.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Good morning, Chair Homendy and members Landsberg, Graham, and Chapman. This morning, staff will present our investigation into the anchor strike of the San Pedro Bay pipeline that led to the crude oil release beginning on October 1st, 2021. In addition to those who are participating in today's meeting, I would like to acknowledge the staff noted here for their support and assistance during the investigation and report development. I would also like to acknowledge the staff noted here who produced this virtual board meeting. The NTSB was the lead federal agency for the pipeline element of this investigation. The U.S. Coast Guard was the lead federal agency for the marine element. As noted by the chair, parties to the investigation are listed here, and we thank them for their assistance throughout the investigation. The 17-mile-long San Pedro Bay pipeline was operated by Beta Offshore, a subsidiary of Amplify Energy Corporation. The pipeline transported crude oil from Platform Ellie, located in San Pedro Bay off the coast of Huntington Beach, California, to the Beta pump station located in Long Beach, California. The 16-inch diameter pipeline was constructed in 1980 and made of steel with a concrete weight coating. Shipping pumps located on Platform Ellie moved crude oil through the pipeline. On the afternoon of October 1st, 2021, the system on Platform Ellie that separated oil and water from the mixture coming from production wells experienced problems that resulted in more water than normal entering the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Operators spent several hours working on the issue, and they repaired the problem about 1600. In addition to the problem with the oil-water separation system, controllers had also been receiving multiple communication loss alarms throughout the day, indicating lost communications between Platform Ellie and the pump station. At 1610, the San Pedro Bay pipeline leak detection system alarmed in the control room on Platform Ellie. The control room console showed that the leak location was at mile 0, indicating a leak at the pipeline's origin at the platform. Pipeline controllers assumed the alarm was erroneous and had activated due to the water content in the pipeline resulting from the earlier problem with the water separator system. Over the next several hours, controllers troubleshot the leak detection system, stopping and restarting the pipeline's online shipping pump several times during the process. With each restart of the pipeline, the leak detection alarm sounded. Personnel visually checked for leaks on Platform Ellie by observing the pumps, the discharge line, and meters, and no leaks were found. At 23:30, the leak detection alarm sounded again, the 7th time the alarm had sounded. In response, the pipeline controller and a superintendent conducted a manual leak detection calculation while the shipping pump continued to run. The manual leak detection calculation, which was completed at 0220 on October 2nd, showed a difference in the number of barrels of oil being pumped from platform Ellie to the Beta pump station. Consequently, the controller shut down the pipeline's online shipping pump. Between 0330 and 0510 on October 2nd, the vessel Nicholas L. conducted a right-of-way inspection on orders from the pipeline operator. Because it was dark, the vessel crew visually observed the water above the pipeline's entire path using a spotlight and flashlights. No oil was found, and the pipeline shipping pump was restarted at the completion of the inspection. At 0528, the leak detection alarm sounded for the 8th time. The shipping pump was stopped and a second daylight right-of-way inspection was ordered. At 0809, the crew of the Nicholas L reported a 60-foot wide by 1.5 mile long oil sheen on the water. An estimated 588 barrels of oil leaked from the pipeline as a result of the accident. Post-leak surveys of the San Pedro Bay pipeline showed that a 4,025-foot section of the pipeline had been displaced with a maximum displacement of 105 feet from the original pipeline location. The surveys also found indications of a longitudinal crack on the outer surface of the pipe located near the point of maximum displacement. Finally, the surveys revealed scarring on the seafloor along the length of the displaced section of pipeline that was consistent with anchor dragging, which occurs when a vessel's anchor fails to hold on the seafloor and the vessel moves with the current, seas, or wind trailing its anchor. The U.S. Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board reviewed evidence to identify vessels that were anchored near the pipeline and could have dragged anchor into its path. Radar data and radio communications recorded by Vessel Traffic Service Los Angeles Long Beach confirmed that two vessels, the container ships Beijing and MSC Danet, had dragged anchor near the oil leak location on January 25, 2021, nearly 9 months prior to the leak. The 109,000 gross ton container ship Beijing was 1,150 feet long, about the size of a U.S. Navy Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It had a container capacity of about 9,500 20-foot equivalent units, or TEUs, and was one of the largest ships in service when it was built in 2006. However, container ships have continued to grow in size and cargo capacity since that time. The Beijing had a single main propulsion engine and was fitted with two 16.5-ton high-holding power anchors. The 153,000 gross ton container ship MSC Danet was only slightly longer than the Beijing, but its considerably larger breadth allowed it to carry about 50% more container cargo. Built in 2009, it was also one of the largest container ships in service upon its introduction, but much larger container ships are now in service today. The MSC Danet had a single main propulsion engine and was fitted with two 21.5-ton high-holding power anchors. On January 25, 2021, the MSC Danet was anchored in anchorage position SF3 with 7 shots or 630 feet of anchor chain paid out. SF3 was within the charted federal anchorage F in San Pedro Bay. The eastern boundary of anchorage F ran parallel to the San Pedro Bay pipeline at a distance of 180 feet, and the center of anchorage position SF3 was about 2,600 feet from the pipeline. The Beijing was anchored in contingency anchorage position SF12 with 6 shots or 540 feet of anchor chain paid out. The contingency anchorage positions were not shown on nautical charts, but had been established by the Coast Guard for use during periods of heavy port loading. In January 2021, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach were experiencing extreme backups as a result of supply chain disruptions caused by the COVID pandemic. The center of anchorage position SF12 was about 2,700 feet from the San Pedro Bay pipeline. The Beijing and the MSC Danet had been assigned to their anchorage positions by watchstanders at Vessel Traffic Service Los Angeles Long Beach. VTS LA Long Beach was jointly operated by the Coast Guard and the Marine Exchange of Southern California under a public-private partnership, and provided active monitoring and navigational advice for vessels in the VTS area of responsibility. VTS LA Long Beach watchstanders assigned anchorage positions based on various parameters, including vessel's draft, length, and type. After assigning an anchorage, the VTS watchstander monitored the vessel's position to ensure that the vessel anchored in the assigned position and did not subsequently drag anchor. VTS LA Long Beach watchstanders used a commercial maritime surveillance system to monitor vessels entering, exiting, and anchored within the service's area of responsibility. In the morning on January 25th, high winds were predicted for the coastal waters of Southern California due to a cold front moving through the area, and the National Weather Service had issued a gale warning. As expected, winds and seas increased significantly starting at 0330. About 20 minutes later, the Beijing began dragging anchor to the east. The captain ordered the ship's engine started and directed crew members to the bow to prepare to heave up the anchor. Please note that the animations that will be shown throughout this presentation have been accelerated due to time constraints. The red line indicates the position of the vessel's AIS transponder and not the location of the anchor. As it dragged anchor, the Beijing moved laterally out of anchorage position SF-12, and its heading remained to the northwest. At 0405, the vessel's AIS position passed over the charted location of the San Pedro Bay pipeline. At the same time, the crew began heaving in the ship's anchor. However, 5 minutes later, the anchor windlass stopped unexpectedly. By 0411, the Beijing's engine had been started and the crew used various engine speeds to attempt to maintain position. A minute later, the ship's eastward progress was halted. At this moment, the Beijing's bow, from which the vessel's anchor chain extended, was 590 feet from where it had passed over the San Pedro Bay pipeline's charted location. Over the next 3 hours, the crew of the Beijing troubleshot the motor on the anchor windlass with the anchor still deployed. While troubleshooting the anchor windlass motor, the crew attempted to maintain position using the ship's engine and bow thruster. About 0551, the container ship CMA CGM Mexico, which had been anchored to the west of the Beijing, began dragging anchor into SF-12, where the Beijing had been anchored. The CMA CGM Mexico eventually heaved in its anchor and got underway about an hour later. At 0700, the Beijing crew determined that the anchor windlass motor was burned out, and the crew was ordered to change out the motor, a process that would take several hours. Meanwhile, the ship continued to maneuver near the pipeline, passing over it at least 10 times. Finally, about 0900, the Beijing re-entered SF-12 and did not encroach on the San Pedro Bay pipeline again. Around midnight that night, after the anchor windlass motor had been replaced, the Beijing departed the anchorage. About 0516 on the same morning, the MSC Danet had began moving in a generally eastward direction while swinging to the south and then back to the north. The crew started the ship's main propulsion engine at 0523, and over the next 26 minutes, the bridge team issued various engine orders in an attempt to maintain the ship's position. At 0549, a watchstander on the MSC Danet radioed VTS LA Long Beach to report that the vessel was no longer holding position and that the ship was starting to heave in its anchor. The container ship continued to move in an easterly direction, and at 0553, the vessel's AIS position passed over the charted location of the San Pedro Bay pipeline. The MSC Danet movement continued until at 0617, its eastward progress stopped. For the next 36 minutes, the vessel moved along a north-south axis, but did not appreciably move to the east or west. When its eastward progress had stopped, the ship's bow was about 842 feet southeast of the location where the leak in the San Pedro Bay pipeline would eventually be found. About the same time that the MSC Danet had begun dragging anchor, the tanker Hong Kong Spirit, which had been anchored to the west of the MSC Danet, had also begun dragging anchor in an easterly direction. At 0617, the Hong Kong Spirit drifted into the MSC Danet's assigned anchorage position. The MSC Danet's crew informed VTS LA Long Beach that their vessel was coming into a dangerous situation with the Hong Kong Spirit. The MSC Danet crew ceased heaving in the anchor, and the master ordered 2 additional shots, or 180 feet, of anchor chain paid out in order to avoid a collision with the Hong Kong Spirit. In addition to the Hong Kong Spirit, the MSC Danet was also monitoring the position of the Beijing, which was on the vessel's port side. By 0657, the Hong Kong Spirit was underway and departed anchorage position SF3. The MSC Danet recommenced heaving in its anchor shortly thereafter. As it heaved in its anchor, the MSC Danet moved forward. However, at 0703, the ship's progress halted with the ship directly over the pipeline. For the next 1 hour and 8 minutes, the ship's AIS position remained within an area of about 600 feet radius centered on the eventual leak location. At 0811, the vessel began moving forward again and, 5 minutes later, reported anchors away to VTS LA Long Beach. The MSC Danet proceeded west and exited the anchorage. Staff concluded the following items were not safety issues for this accident: the as-manufactured material condition of the pipeline, overpressurization of the pipeline, the experience and qualifications of the vessel crews and VTS personnel, and fatigue of the vessel crews and VTS watchstanders. Staff will present the following safety focus areas for this casualty, to include the insufficient distance between the anchorage locations and the San Pedro Bay pipeline, the need for notification of potential pipeline damage to pipeline operators, the need for improvements to VTS vessel monitoring systems, the incorrect response by pipeline controllers to the leak alarms, and the lack of post-accident alcohol and other drug testing for pipeline controllers. This concludes my presentation. Mr. Meadows will now discuss pipeline damage.
Thank you, Mr. Ellers. I will be presenting the results of evidence examination and the testing of the damaged pipeline. My presentation will cover the following topics with respect to the examination of damaged segments from the San Pedro Bay pipeline: the physical evidence collected from damaged segments that were removed from the seafloor in the vicinity of the leak site, visual observations of local damage where the leak occurred, results of 3-dimensional scanning performed to assess deformation damage, and the observations made during the examination of the crack at the source of the leak. On November 2nd, 2022, NTSB investigators examined 6 segments from the San Pedro Bay pipeline in the vicinity of the leak site, totaling about 250 linear feet, as shown here, which had been removed from service for replacement. The pipeline was constructed in 1980, 16-inch diameter, grade X52 welded steel pipe, as specified in the American Petroleum Institute 5L standard, with a protective outer wrap and 1-inch thick concrete weight coating. Normal operating pressures, according to the operator, were between 300 and 650 psi. The segment which contained the leak site, circled in red, is shown covered with a tarp in this image, north and south ends labeled for reference. The next image shows views along opposite ends of the pipeline segment, which contain the leak site, indicated by the red arrows. Prior to removal from service, the leak site had been temporarily repaired with a welded patch. The segment was generally bowed to the side and showed areas with missing concrete coating, typical example circled in yellow, and areas with out-of-roundness deformation of the pipe profile, example highlighted in blue on the right image. As part of our investigation, the NTSB removed a 9-foot section of the pipe for further analysis, which contain the temporarily repaired leak site, indicated by the red arrow. The top of the pipe is facing down in this view. The next image shows the leak site after removal of the repair patch, with the top of the pipe, 12 o'clock, facing up. The area which had been covered by the repair patch was generally deformed inward, with several gouges observed on the outer surface, as indicated by yellow arrows. Local areas of smeared metal were also observed, as circled in red. A visible crack, approximately 18 inches long, was observed along the longitudinal seam weld toe, highlighted in blue, at approximately the 11 o'clock position, as viewed from the perspective of crude oil flow. Prior to any further destructive evaluation, the segment of pipe with the welded patch removed was 3D scanned to characterize the deformation damage at the leak site. The image shows a contour map along the upper surface of the pipe that was generated from the scan data and shows outer surface deformation damage relative to a 16-inch diameter cylinder. Red areas correspond to areas where the outer surface was bulged outward, and the blue color scale represents areas where the pipe was indented, with darker shades indicating a deeper dent. Scan data which corresponded to remnants of the welded repair patch around the leak site were excluded from this analysis. The right image shows a cross-section view of the pipe profile relative to a reference cylinder, where the largest indentation along the crack was observed. Internal pressure from crude oil being pumped would attempt to press the pipe back outward to restore the circular shape, resulting in higher stresses in the pipe wall where dents are present. These higher local stresses can initiate cracking, and the severity depends on the dent size and shape, as well as material properties. At the crack location, the pipe was deformed inward approximately 2.5 inches. The crack where the leak occurred was removed from the pipe segment and split open for closer examination. A portion of the fracture surface, which extended completely through the pipe wall, with the outer surface of the pipe oriented along the bottom, is shown here. The yellow dashed line highlights the boundary of a fatigue crack which extended from multiple origin areas along the outer surface. No inclusions, defects, or other anomalies were observed at the origin areas, in the base material, or the adjacent weld. As mentioned previously, fatigue cracking can initiate at areas of high stress concentration, such as those created by dents, as well as notches created at weld interfaces, with combined effects being more detrimental. Once initiated, fatigue cracks grew incrementally over time from pressure changes experienced during normal pipeline operations, such as pump start and stop cycles. When the fatigue crack reached a critical size, the remaining intact portion of the pipe wall fractured rapidly, as it could no longer support the load from the internal crude oil pressure, and oil was released. Mechanical testing and chemical analysis performed on representative material revealed no issues with the quality or performance of the pipe construction. From the pipe examination, staff found the release of crude oil occurred as a result of fatigue failure that manifested over a period of time in an area of local deformation to the San Pedro Bay pipeline, caused by an external force applied to the pipeline that resulted in progressive cracks initiating and growing through the pipe wall until the pipe wall ruptured. This concludes my presentation. Mr. Ellers will now discuss nautical operations.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. I will now be presenting the nautical operations aspects of this accident. During this presentation, I will discuss the anchor dragging by the container ships MSC Danet and Beijing, the location of their anchorage, and the notification of pipeline damage to the pipeline owner or operator. The displacement of the San Pedro Bay pipeline was not uniform on either side of the point of maximum displacement, suggesting that the displacement was the result of more than one external force applied to the pipeline. Post-accident surveys identified damage, including the loss of concrete coating and deformation, along the full length of the displaced pipeline. Additionally, the surveys found several seabed scars along the length of the displaced section of the pipeline that were indicative of anchors being dragged. One of the scar tracks led directly to the point of maximum displacement of the pipeline, which was also the location of the crude oil leak. On January 25, 2021, the container ships Beijing and MSC Danet dragged anchor in high winds and seas caused by a cold front moving through the San Pedro Bay. Automatic identification system data showed that while dragging anchor, the vessels crossed over the area where the displaced pipeline would eventually be found. Based on the NTSB's modeling of the vessel's anchor positions, it is clear that the anchors would have struck the pipeline during this event. The NTSB Materials Laboratory found that the crack in the San Pedro Bay pipeline where the crude oil leak occurred originated from an area of localized deformation, suggesting that the damage that specifically led to the crack was a result of the anchor strike an anchor strike at the leak location. Although the Beijing passed over the pipeline numerous times, with its anchor striking and damaging the pipeline, the ship did not pass over the eventual leak location. The MSC Danet, however, passed over the pipeline leak location several times while dragging anchor. Staff found that, as a result of the winds and seas generated by a strong cold front, the container ships Beijing and MSC Danet dragged anchor, and the anchors struck, displaced, and damaged the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Further, staff found that although both ships' anchors struck, damaged, and displaced the pipeline, the MSC Danet anchor's contact with the San Pedro Bay pipeline was the initiating event that led to the eventual crude oil release. Dragging anchor is a rare occurrence, and it may take time for a vessel crew to recognize the condition and take action. When a crew has determined that their vessel's anchor is dragging and decides to get underway, readying the ship to heave in the anchor may take 15 minutes or more, even under emergency situations. Once the crew has begun heaving in the anchor, the process is slow. For example, at its rated speed, the Beijing's anchor windlass would have needed 18 minutes to heave in its initially deployed 6 shots or 540 feet of anchor chain under normal conditions, had the windlass not failed. The MSC Danet would likely have required additional time, even under optimal conditions. Anchor dragging situations are most likely to occur under severe wind and sea conditions, putting a strain on equipment and increasing the time necessary to heave in the anchor. Designated anchoring positions must provide a sufficient margin of safety between anchored vessels and any nearby hazard, including pipelines. The margin of safety must account for the time necessary for a crew to get a vessel underway during an anchor dragging situation, and must also account for the size of the vessels anchoring in these positions. The center of anchoring position is here SF3 within federal anchorage F, and the center of anchored position SF12, a contingency anchorage southwest of anchorage F, were located 2,700 feet or less from the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Thus, with the winds from the northwest as they were on January 25th, the Beijing and MSC Danet were less than 1 ship length away from the pipeline even before their anchors began to drag. When the ship's crews determined that their vessels were dragging anchor, they took action in a reasonable amount of time, given the time necessary to confirm their navigational situation, complete the engine starting procedures, and crew the anchor stations on the bow. However, once the container ships began dragging anchors, the crews could not heave in their anchors before the anchors struck the San Pedro Bay pipeline, because the distance between the assigned anchorage positions and the pipeline. Staff found that because of the proximity of the anchorage positions to the pipeline, the crews of the Beijing and the MSC Danet had insufficient time and space to heave in their dragging anchors in high winds and seas before the anchors contacted the pipeline. Further, staff found that the southeast boundary of anchorage F and the location of contingency anchorage positions southwest of anchorage F did not leave sufficient margin of safety between anchored vessels and the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Staff proposes one recommendation to the U.S. Coast Guard. The release of oil from the San Pedro Bay pipeline occurred nearly 9 months after the ship's anchors struck the San Pedro Bay pipeline. If the damage to the pipeline had been identified immediately after the anchor strikes, Beta could have completed repairs before the leak occurred. However, Beta was not notified of the anchor dragging events and therefore did not conduct a survey that would have revealed the damage to the pipeline. One of the VTS's principal functions is to assist in the safe navigation of vessels through a port, and VTS watchstanders should be able to identify and warn vessels when a potential danger exists, such as the risk of contact with a pipeline. VTS LA Long Beach watchstanders told investigators that they had been trained on and were aware of the San Pedro Bay pipeline's location near the anchorage. But VTS LA Long Beach's area of responsibility spans over 1,000 square miles, and it is not feasible for a watchstander to recall all of the area's potential hazards and danger zones from memory alone. An overlay or a chart layer showing the San Pedro Bay pipeline on the VTS LA Long Beach vessel monitoring system would have provided the watchstanders with a visual indication of its presence at the time of the anchor dragging events on January 25, 2021. However, no overlay was available, and the nautical chart layers showing pipeline hazards were turned off because of excessive clutter. Watchstanders monitored the movements of the Beijing and MSC Danet, but they did not recognize the hazard presented to the pipeline as the vessels dragged anchor. Consequently, VTS LA Long Beach watchstanders provided no warnings of the pipeline to the Beijing or the MSC Danet crews. Since the oil release, VTS LA Long Beach has added visual overlays to the San Pedro Bay pipeline and other pipelines to its vessel monitoring system to assist watchstanders in identifying vessels that may be encroaching on the pipelines. Additional updates to the system could further enhance safety by increasing watchstander awareness of potential hazards. Staff found that had the pipeline operator been made aware of the Beijing and MSC Danet anchor dragging, the company could have conducted an underwater survey of the pipeline, identified the damage, and made repairs, preventing the eventual release of crude oil. Further, staff found that due to the absence of a visual indicator of the San Pedro Bay pipeline on the VTS LA Long Beach vessel monitoring system and exceptionally high vessel activity occurring in the anchorage due to weather, the VTS watchstanders did not recognize the danger presented to the San Pedro Bay pipeline by the Beijing and MSC Danet dragging anchors. Staff believes that an audible and visual alarm on the VTS LA Long Beach vessel monitoring system that alerts when an anchored vessel is encroaching on a pipeline would improve watchstander awareness of the possibility of an anchor strike in the San Pedro Bay anchorages. Staff proposes one recommendation to the Coast Guard and one recommendation to the Marine Exchange of Southern California. Even if the VTS watchstanders had recognized the danger of the dragging anchors, they did not have a procedure for informing the company of potential damage to the pipeline. The consequences of a pipeline breach and subsequent oil release to health, safety, and environment are so great that even the possibility of damage needs to be reported immediately so that it can be addressed and environmental damage minimized. Therefore, a system must be in place to inform pipeline and other utility operators when any known or potential incursion has occurred on an underwater pipeline in ports and waterways. Staff found that defined procedures for informing pipeline and other utility operators when possible incursions have occurred within the VTS area of responsibility would improve the pipeline or utility operator's ability to identify and respond to any damage. Staff proposes one recommendation to the Coast Guard. This concludes my presentation. Ms. West will now discuss pipeline operations.
Thank you, Mr. Ehlers. I will be presenting the pipeline operations aspect of this accident. My presentation will discuss the following topics: pipeline operators' incorrect response to leak alarms, and the lack of post-accident alcohol and other drugs testing. During the accident, several abnormal operating conditions were present in the pipeline, including water buildup in the pipeline, an incorrect leak location indicated by the leak detection system, and frequent previous communication loss alarms. First leak alarm activated shortly after the problems with the oil-water separation system that caused water buildup and was repaired. The experienced night shift controller was with the day shift controller when the first and second leak alarms activated. Given the day shift controller's extended awake hours, he was susceptible to the performance of effects of acute fatigue at the time of the first alarm activated. Throughout the course of troubleshooting the leak alarms, controllers assumed that many abnormal operations were due to the excess water in the system. The leak detection system indicated that the location of the leak was at mile 0 at platform LE, instead of displaying the actual location of the leak on the underwater portion of the pipeline. The controllers sent a crew member to visually observe the water surface at platform LE, and each time the crew member confirmed that no oil was on the water at the platform. This further confirmed the controller's initial assumption that the leak alarms were false alarms. Seventh leak alarm activated. The night shift controller continued to run one pump so that the onshore and offshore crew could conduct a manual leak detection calculation. While the manual leak detection calculation showed a 16 to 20 barrel per hour difference between the volume shipped from platform LE and the volume received at Beta Pump Station, the crew still did not isolate the pipeline. Before the accident, the San Pedro Bay pipeline had no history of leaks. Supervisory control and data acquisition systems, SCADA, can be affected by environmental conditions such as fog, wind, or other inclement weather, causing momentary communication loss. If the signal from the instrumentation were long enough or absent, the communication loss alarm would be triggered. Controllers received communication loss alarms throughout the day on October 1st. The pipeline had a history of experiencing communication loss alarms. A shift pipeline controller told investigators that he was thinking that it was just a regular loss of communication, and it didn't really dawn on me that it was actually a leak because it happens to us all the time. Staff found the abnormal operating conditions such as water buildup in the pipeline, an incorrect leak location indicated by the leak detection system, and frequent previous communication loss alarms contributed to the pipeline controller's incorrect determination that the leak alarms were false. Had San Pedro Bay pipeline controllers responded in accordance with the company procedures for a leak by shutting down and isolating their pipeline, they would have significantly reduced the volume of crude oil released and the resulting environmental damage. The insufficient training of the pipeline controllers contributed to a 14-hour delay in stopping the pipeline's shipping pumps and the increased volume of crude oil released following the first leak alarm. And lastly, although the day shift pipeline controller was likely affected by the adverse performance effects of acute fatigue, the incorrect response and assessment of the leak alarms was due to insufficient training of the day shift pipeline controller and night shift pipeline controller. The pipeline controllers on duty were not tested for alcohol and other drugs following the oil release discovery, as required by regulation. According to Beta, they did not conduct testing because at the time of the release, the cause was unknown. However, without drug test results, it's not possible to determine whether alcohol or other drug use contributed to the pipeline controller's actions on the night of the accident. Beta's decision not to conduct required post-accident alcohol and other drug testing resulted in an absence of safety-critical information PHMSA did not take exception to Beta's absence of post-accident drug testing. Staff found that although there are no indications of alcohol and other drug use by the controllers, on duty at the time of the crude oil release, evidence was insufficient to determine whether alcohol and other drug use contributed to the pipeline's leak and severity of the accident. Further, staff found that Beta Offshore was not in compliance with the regulations, and the company did not drug test the pipeline controllers following the accident. Therefore, staff proposes a safety recommendation to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. This concludes staff's presentations. We are now prepared to answer questions you may have.
Thank you very much. As usual, I am very impressed with all the work that was done on this investigation. A lot of incredible work and frankly, a short amount of time. So thanks very much. We're going to move on to questions. I'm going to do a little roll call too, just to make sure everyone's ready for questioning. We have Member Landsberg, Member Graham, Member Chapman, if you could just pop up real quick. Member Chapman. Okay, great. So we'll start with issue round one with Member Landsberg, and we're going to start. That issue area is weather, anchor dragging, and damage to the pipeline. Okay, Member Landsberg.
Chair, thank you very much, and my appreciation to the staff for an excellent report done under unusual and difficult circumstances. I don't know that we usually get to the scene of an investigation 9 months after the event has happened. So I think you did an excellent sleuthing job of figuring out how all of this worked. First question, how good is the holding ground in the anchorage as a recreational sailor? I have learned the hard way that some types of holding ground are much better than others, and I would think an area as heavily trafficked as that, the ground would be pretty well torn up.
Yes, the bottom type there in San Pedro Bay is charted as sand, and depending on the consistency of sand, it can be a fairly good holding medium. We had no indications during our investigation that there was a problem with the holding ground there and whether ships were having trouble holding ground, other than the day, January 25th, where those anchor draggings occurred.
So San Pedro Bay and that area does not have a history of typically a lot of ships dragging anchor. Is that correct?
Not that we uncovered during our investigation.
Okay. I was noticing it's only 20 minutes after the wind increase that we started to see the first anchor drag. Is that normal?
I would say, first of all, an anchor dragging is not normal. But as far as the how quickly wind and seas impact a vessel, the winds will impact a vessel immediately upon in their onset. And in this case, being a strong cold front, the onset was very quick. Vessels such as the Danet in Beijing, with a lot of containers, I have a lot of sail area, a lot of surface area, the wind affects. So that wind will take immediate effect. And seas can build surprisingly quick, even in small bodies of water. And where those winds were coming from the northwest, they had a lot of ground in order to build up seas. So as far as impinging on the vessel, it wasn't necessarily surprising how quickly it had an effect, but the fact that they did drag anchor was unusual.
For Mr. Suffren, how much wind will trigger a high wind warning or heavy weather event?
So in the National Weather Service, there are three main wind criteria that will issue for different warnings for vessels. Between 20 and 33 knots, there's a small craft advisory. Between 34 and 47 knots is a gale warning, such as on the day of the accident. And 48 knots up to 63 knots is a storm warning. So those are the three main criteria below a hurricane force.
So this was categorized as a gale event?
Correct.
Okay. I also noted, are these kinds of conditions normal for the San Pedro Bay area? I mean, the Chamber of Commerce says, you know, they usually have good weather and sunshine.
So for that particular region, the cold fronts impact the area anywhere from about 5 to 10 times a year, depending on the given year. But they do occur most frequently between November all the way through about May.
And I noticed, I think in the report, they said that there was a prior gale warning event, but the winds were from the northeast, sort of a similar magnitude, but that didn't cause any problem. Why the difference?
Yeah, that is correct. There were gale force winds about 6 days prior, but those winds were from the northeast, so off the land. And it takes time and distance with wind to build seas, high sea conditions. And given that they were from the northeast, there was just a small amount of distance, and therefore the waves and seas were not particularly high 6 days prior.
Understand. Well, my time is about up, so I'll stop here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that during the gale warning on January 25th, the VTS watch standards advised vessels to have engines on immediate standby and a second anchor ready for letting go. Did the MSC Danet in Beijing comply with the VTS advisory?
We believe they did. It's worth noting that both of these vessels had slow speed diesels directly coupled to the propellers. So if the engine is started, the propeller is turning. So the fact that the engines weren't on does not mean that they were not in a state of readiness. The other thing to note is that it does take time to get engines started. So we believe that it took them each less than 15 minutes to start their engines. So we believe that was sufficient readiness. As far as a second anchor for letting go, an anchor is generally is not hard to drop an anchor quickly. However, most mariners, I think, would not choose to drop a second anchor in an anchor dragging situation because there is risk of both anchors become entangled, the anchor chains become entangled. So I think most mariners would either take two options. One is put out more anchor chain on the already deployed anchor, which allows the weight of the anchor chain to provide some more holding power, or as these two ships chose, to attempt to get underway.
So it sounds like they pretty much complied with the advisory, but the time it takes to start the engine, start maneuvering, and if they start dragging anchor, from their presentation, it looks like they probably didn't have enough room to be able to maneuver to get the anchor up in time.
Yes, that's what the staff found.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Were either the Danet or the Beijing aware of the pipeline location?
They should have been. I should note that because of the time between when the anchor dragging occurred and when the leak was discovered and we began the investigation, we did not board the ships until much later. By that time, the crews had rotated. So we did not get to interview some key individuals, such as the masters of these vessels. That being said, we were able to reconstruct the accident through a lot of other different means. But having said that, all of the vessels had a electronic chart display system, which would have shown the pipeline. So they should have been aware of the pipeline.
Okay. So if they were aware that they might have dragged an anchor over a pipeline, would that have been a reportable event?
If they believed that they had struck the pipeline, yes, it would have been a reportable event. Anytime you create a hazard that impacts a structure or another vessel, you have to report it. However, it's undetermined whether they had clues that they had not struck the pipeline. To be fair, they were able to retrieve their anchors for one, and also there was no, as we've briefed, there was no pollution element on the day that they drug anchor. So they likely believe that they had not struck the pipeline, although their vessels crossed the pipeline. They wouldn't have had a true sense of where their anchor was. There's no indicator on a bridge of a ship saying where the exact location of an anchor is. And once an anchor begins to drag, its location is virtually unknown, other than a very broad knowledge of distance from where the bow. So in sort of a summarize, if the crews did not believe that they had struck the pipeline, then they had no requirement to report it.
Great, thank you for that. And I too want to commend the team for the investigation and the fine report that you all did. So thank you all. I'll come back in the next round.
Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair, and certainly want to add my praise to the great work done on this investigation in terms of identifying the potential dates and the potential vessels that might have contacted the pipeline. I understand that the analysis of the AIS data was critical in the investigation. Can I ask, please, will you just briefly describe how the weather analysis and the AIS analysis were conducted and how that data was correlated?
Sure. We began with the last known time that the pipeline was intact, which was May 2020. An ROV inspection of the pipeline was conducted. So we knew that the accident had occurred, the anchor dragging or the displacement of the pipeline had occurred sometime between May 2020, when that previous survey had been conducted, and when the oil leak happened on October 1st of 2021. So in conjunction with the Coast Guard, we reviewed AIS data, so ship location data for across that time period. And then we looked at whether or not, and we filtered it by the most obvious indicators of a ship that's at anchor: very slow speed, a movement in the opposite direction of heading, that kind of thing. We also did a review, Mr. Suffern, of what the heavy wind or heavy weather events were between those two dates that I stated. And we looked in particular at those dates as far as AIS data. Bottom line is we identified only 5 ships that were anywhere near the pipeline at a slow speed over that period. And we were able to rule out 3 others due to their location or their mode of operation. And we were able to narrow that down to the MSC Dana in the Beijing.
Just really impressive detective work, and commend all of you for what you did to identify the 2 ships involved. Is there a specific regulatory or technical standard with respect to the required accuracy of AIS data?
There is a standard. I can't exactly give it to you right now, but what I will say to you is it is very accurate. In very few cases have we seen. There's occasionally a single signal, a spurious signal, but those can be easily filtered out. But we also were able to correlate the AIS data that we had with other information. VTS LA Long Beach had recorded their vessel monitoring system data and radio communications, their radar data in particular. And by correlating both the AIS and radar data, we were very confident that the AIS information provided to us was accurate.
Well, and the apparent accuracy of that, I think, was apparent from the animations that you shared earlier, which are really helpful, I think, in helping me at least understand how this occurred. I had read the accounts in the report, but actually seeing the animation was really useful. And how difficult was it for our team to access the necessary AIS data?
It wasn't difficult at all. Number one, the Coast Guard Navigation Center keeps data for 3 years, and they're able to produce it very quickly to us. We also have a commercial provider who maintains data for up to 10 years. And again, very easy to access via online resources through our provider.
So it's possible to go back as far as 10 years with this data.
It is it is somewhat dependent on the location. Some locations are covered better than others. So it's not universal worldwide, I would say, but certainly for ports like Los Angeles, Long Beach, which are major ports, we have significant access to AIS data.
Thanks very much. I have some additional questions for this round. I'll just save those for the next one.
Thanks very much, Member Chapman. Mr. Ellers, you stated in your presentation that the Beijing and MSC Danet were some of the largest ships in service when they were built, but that container ships built since then have grown in size. How much larger are container ships that are being built today?
Well, I'll give you an example. The MSC Irina, also an MSC ship, which entered service earlier this year. It is 1,300 feet long as compared to the 1,200 foot long MSC Danet. But it also carries 2,400 or 24,000 TEUs as compared to the 14,000 TEUs on the Danet. So 70% larger cargo capacity, so significantly larger vessel.
And does the size of the ship have an impact on how a ship reacts in weather?
Absolutely, particularly on container ships where you have large surface area created by both the vessel's hull itself and the containers. Wind effects on that are significant. So the more sail area you put up, the more surface area you put up, the more prone a vessel can be to the effects of wind.
Are these larger ships calling on the ports of LA and Long Beach today?
Yes, they are.
Okay. I have a question for Ms. West. Did the operator, in this case, include the potential for anchor dragging, especially in poor weather in their integrity management or damage prevention programs?
We did not look at in detail their integrity management program, but it wasn't, from what we read, it wasn't mentioned in there.
So it's probably likely, and we'll get into this later, that they did not train for such an event.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, so I am going to see if Member Landsberg has additional questions in this round.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple here. Captain Ehlers, you talk about the fact that it takes about 15 minutes to get a ship underway, even if they're in the standby position. That seems like kind of a long time if the engine is idling, and I think you noted in the report that these are direct drives, so you can't really have the engine on and the propeller not turning. But would it have been prudent, and this is, of course, Monday morning quarterbacking, would it have been prudent for them to have the propeller turning at a very slow speed so that if they needed to, they could immediately take the strain off the anchor?
I would say it would have been prudent if it was possible, but the way ships like the MSC Danet, the direct drive ships like MSC Danet and Beijing operate is they have set engine speeds, dead slow ahead, slow ahead. These are at set speeds of generally 3 knots in benign conditions, 6 knots ahead. So there really isn't a way to have just that very slow unless it's in engineering control, but that means then the bridge is not in control. So bottom line is there really isn't a good way to just have the propeller turning at an exceptionally slow rate. It's essentially it's on or it's off.
So even in dead slow under these conditions, that would not have relieved the strain on the anchor to be able to do that. And again, I'm quarterbacking here in the extreme, but just kind of looking to see if there were any procedural things that might have been done given the constraints of how the ships are designed.
Yeah, a couple of things I would say is first, if an anchor dragging situation or a let's just say a high winds, a potential anchor dragging situation, which I think is what you're saying, it's still a very dynamic situation. So it would require essentially full manning of a watch team, and that's not to say that it can't be done, but it would be it require the full and it would essentially mean getting the ship underway in effect while leaving the anchor up. So there is no benefit, quite frankly, to doing that other than just getting underway.
Understand.
I would also say that going back to the fact that anchor draggings are rare, and the fact that 6 days prior there had been a similar wind event, granted of different direction, but there had been a similar event in which the anchor had held without a problem. I don't think there wasn't an assumption that the vessel would drag anchor. And getting a ship underway, there are impacts as far as crewing and those type of things that have to be accounted for. And so I think that in general, ships will wait until they drag anchor before before using their engines, unless by experience by the master, and this is where the master's experience comes in. The master has a lot of experience and knows that his vessel is prone to dragging anchor. That might change the assessment, but in general, a ship won't get underway merely at the possibility of getting of an anchor dragging.
One last question. Does anyone keep records of dragging events in specific anchorages and sort of the circumstances of, okay, if the winds are out of the northeast, it's not quite as critical under gale conditions, for example. And if the winds are out of the northwest, because you have a lot of open space for seas to build, we're going to take that a bit more seriously. And we've had a number of drags in years prior.
There are no statistics that we found tying anchor dragging to wind direction, say. The BTS LA Long Beach watchstanders do keep a written log of all the events that happen, but to our knowledge, those haven't been correlated into a statistical analysis of when anchor dragging occurs and when it doesn't. Our sense from interviewing all of the watchstanders who had a lot of experience, some going back 20 years, was again that this was a fairly unusual event and not something that regularly occurred, that they had regularly experienced. They did have procedures for when wind increased, as we stated, and they implemented those procedures, putting out warnings starting at 0200. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be any data to suggest that or that they've collected in that regard.
Understand. No further questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Do we know exactly how many times the anchor for each ship dragged across the pipeline?
No, we don't. And again, we could count the number of scars of anchor scouring that occurred. Granted, again, that was 9 months later. But there's really no way to tell specifically how many times each anchor, and because it was two different ships, they were separated a good distance, but not knowing where the anchor physically was at any one time, not knowing specifically, that alone would tell us. So we really can't tell. We know how many times, or we know the damage, but it would be tough to just state exactly how many times it was hit.
Okay, so from the anchor scarring, did we find damage to the pipeline in each of those locations?
Yes.
And we were able to attribute that to an anchor striking the pipeline. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did we find any other kind of damage to the pipeline that might not have been attributed to an anchor? And what I'm getting at is, I lived in California for a number of years, and I know earthquakes are quite common out there. Did we see or look into the fact that maybe seismic activity or an earthquake could have caused some of the damage to the pipeline?
Sure. Yes, we did. We looked specifically at seismic activity because of the location there in Southern California. And after consulting with a U.S. Geological Survey expert, we looked at data across from May of 2020 to October of 2021. And while there was seismic activity, none of it was even close to the magnitude that would have caused damage. So also the nature of the damage, in other words, the displacement in a certain direction over although fairly large but very specific area of the pipeline, was not consistent with seismic activity. So no other damage that we found could be attributed to another cause other than the anchor strikes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And that's all the questions I have in this round, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions. I understand that the San Pedro Bay pipeline falls within what's called a high consequence area, or HCA. The pipeline operator had an integrity management plan that identified risk in HCAs. Can I ask, what is a high consequence area with respect at least to the type of pipeline system involved in this investigation?
Ms. West, can you take that question?
Yes, I'll be glad to. A high consequence area is an area identified where the pipelines have requirements. I'm sorry. It's identified in this particular pipeline as requirements. It's completely covered in a high consequence area.
And what's the definition of a high consequence area?
Sorry, I'm at a blank right now, but I'll get back to you with that question.
Okay, that'll be fine. And am I correct that integrity management plans are required by PHMSA? I think I'm correct in that, right?
That is correct. Where they have a high consequence area.
And what are the essential elements which must be included in an integrity management plan?
Bear with me a minute.
If you want to identify those and come back around, because I'll need the definition of high consequence area too. Just come back and repeat those as we proceed here. That'll be fine.
Miss Lyons, do you have a response?
Sure, yeah. In PHMSA's regulations, high consequence areas have additional requirements, as Kim was mentioning, because of the potential for, impacting either populated areas or environmentally sensitive areas. So that's the intent of the high consequence area. And the integrity management regulations are pretty, I'd say, kind of all encompassing. So pipeline operators are expected to consider all threats to their asset and to mitigate those threats. to provide reasonable assurance that, public safety and the environment are protected.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Chair, that's all the questions I have for this round.
Thank you very much. And in the regulations, the standard is really could affect an environmentally sensitive area or high population area. So in this case, it should have been considered a threat and addressed in their integrity management program or plan, although I find it interesting that in PHMSA's notice of probable violation, I did not see any proposed civil penalties for their integrity management program. But it is something that should be addressed as a potential threat. And certainly that's something that would also be addressed if and hopefully Beta and others have implemented a safety management system that we've been encouraging pipeline operators to implement for quite some time. Does anyone know whether Beta has or Amplify Energy has a SMS program?
In my conversations with Amplify, I asked them specifically, do they have a safety management system or pipeline safety management system in place? And they said they do not.
They do not. Okay. Do they have? Are you aware of whether they implemented one as any sort of action to address what occurred here as a result of the anchor strike of this pipeline? I know that they did make some safety improvements. So I'm just wondering if we have any information on whether they did anything with respect to implementing an SMS.
Conversations I had with them, they quoted that the safety management system was very similar to their SEMS regulation, and not having looked at it in detail to tell you exactly how they overlap. But this was their proposal as to how they were addressing some issues on safety of the pipeline and other actions as required by the SNS program.
And I'm curious, did they implement any sort of process, or did they have something prior to this anchor strike where they would operate an ROV or send divers to look at the integrity of their pipeline in certain intervals?
Yes. Would you like me to answer that? Yes. As required by BSEE, they have to do a couple things. They have to do a ROV or remote operated vehicle inspection along the pipeline, the entire length of the pipeline, as well as internal inspections through integrity. Through ILI or pigging. So they do those testing in alternating years, but they're required every 2 years.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And Member Landsberg, do you have additional questions in this round?
No further questions, Chair. Thank you.
All right, Member Graham.
No further questions in this round for me. Thank you.
Perfect. Member Chapman.
No further questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for your excellent answers. And we will move on to rounds of questions on issue number 2, which is anchorage location, hazard awareness, and notification of damage to the pipeline operator, starting with Member Landsberg.
Thank you, Chair. So I believe I read that the size of the anchorage was significantly expanded a number of years ago to incorporate the space for additional traffic. And there was a much larger buffer at that time. And of course, the ships were a lot smaller. Am I understanding that correctly? And then what was the thought process relative to saying we could get closer to the pipeline without incurring any additional risk?
So to answer your first question, yes, the the anchorage F, which we've described, was significantly expanded in 2004. The anchorage was originally drawn in 1980, right about the same time that the pipeline was constructed. And as part of that original pipeline construction, the pipeline builder, Shell, was required to keep the pipeline 500 yards, 1,500 feet away from the anchorage. So in 2004, the Anchorage Coast Guard put out a proposal through a notice of proposed rulemaking to expand the anchorage, which brought it up to the as briefed distance 180 feet away from the San Pedro Bay pipeline. They in their notice of public rulemaking, there was a statement they had considered an executive order regarding impact to the to energy, and also they looked at the environmental national environmental policy and concluded that there was no impact, or the impact was minimal. They also briefed the expansion, the proposed expansion in 2004 to the Los Angeles Long Beach Harbor Safety Committee. And on that committee includes representatives from the Corps of Engineers, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, shipping representatives, environmental interests, and they briefed that expansion, noted that in the notice of public rulemaking there was a period of public comment, and 2 years later, or a year and a half later, at the end of that commenting period, they had received no comments from any organization, and so they expanded the anchorage as proposed in 2004. So it went into effect in 2006. A long way to say that there was no objection from any organization to the expansion.
So I think, would it be safe to say that because we never had a problem here before, and we didn't really anticipate, even though the conditions, the size of the ships and so forth were changing significantly, that this would be good sense? So really, we were not looking very far ahead. Is that a fair statement or no?
Well, interestingly enough, it was the proposal as it was described in the notice of public rulemaking was in some ways looking ahead. In other words, it was based on the fact that ship sizes were increasing. Now, I don't think that the Coast Guard or anyone else could have imagined what container ships have grown to be in this day and age, but it was based on a need to increase the number and size of anchorages. But I believe it was for the throughput of the port that the expansion was proposed to help the port, move more ships through.
Understand. Okay, thank you. No further questions now, Chair. I'll have one more for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Let's go back to that distance from the anchorage, the pipeline. I saw the original Army Corps of Engineers permit from the San Pedro Bay pipeline required that it be 1,500 feet from anchorage F. Do we know how that distance was determined?
We don't. That was from the original 1979 permit. So the source of that 1,500 feet or 500 yards, as is actually stated in the permit, is unknown.
Okay. Do we know if it was constructed in compliance with that permit, and did they verify that distance?
It was, I don't know of verification, but what I can say is that with the exception of the northeast corner of the original anchorage F, it was at least 500 yards, 1,500 feet away. The corner of anchorage F in its original 1980 did come within 500 yards, although anchorage positions within that were well away from the pipeline. I think the closest was about 4,000 feet away.
You talked about the expansion project, and there was no objections by the Army Corps of Engineers. And that outer boundary from the closest anchorage to the pipeline reduced from, I think it was 2,430 feet down to just 180 feet. Does the team believe that's enough or was enough at this point?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So do you believe that the 1,500, the original 1,500 would have been a sufficient margin of safety?
I think that our assessment would be it would be the absolute minimum. When you consider a ship dragging anchor at about 1.5 knots, they would cover 1,500 feet in a direct line in about 10 minutes. Now a ship wouldn't be necessarily right on the perimeter of that anchorage area. They wouldn't be necessarily dragging anchor in a straight line. But as we've discussed earlier about the time it takes to recover an anchor, to get underway, et cetera, that 1,500 feet it would leave little room for error.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed too, they, besides the standard anchorages, there were 9 contingency anchorages also within close proximity to the pipeline. Were these positions defined in the CFR or included on any navigational charts?
No, they weren't.
They were not. Okay. So what are they doing now? Have they changed anything?
They have. VTS LA Long Beach, in conjunction with the Coast Guard, who have voluntarily stopped using those anchorage positions closest to the pipeline, also closest to another pipe, a sewage outfall in the Huntington Beach area. They've also changed the contingency anchorage to increase space between them. And then they've also discontinued use of a lot of the other positions, essentially, again, to expand space between all the vessels. So those are temporary solutions. VTS LA Long Beach has proposed a permanent restructuring of Anchorage F and the federal anchorage there. And we have proposed a recommendation to support that initiative.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ellers. And Chair, that's all I have in this section. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. For consideration today, I believe our team is proposing 3 recommendations to the U.S. Coast Guard. One is specific to the Los Angeles Long Beach vessel traffic area, particularly in the San Pedro Bay federal anchorages area, and 2 other recommendations have national scope. How unique is the San Pedro Bay area with respect to the lack of sufficient margin of safety between anchored vessels and infrastructure such as pipelines?
That's a tough question because there are mitigating factors, such as in the anchorages in certain areas, the pipelines may be buried to again mitigate the or they may have a protective covering. But there are pipelines and other utilities, as we've noted in the draft report, that crisscross America's ports. San Pedro Bay is not unusual in having a pipeline run through a part of the waterways of the port. It's not unusual in having other utilities, electrical and communications cables, such that. So it's certainly a concern for all the ports. And I believe partially in response to this accident, Coast Guard has directed all of their districts, sectors, and marine safety units to conduct an assessment of their anchorages, specifically looking at hazards such as this and other things, and considering whether to restructure the anchorages in other ports throughout the U.S.
Well, that's encouraging because I think one thing we know from this investigation, it's absolutely possible that this or similar safety risks might be present in other vessel traffic areas or other container ports, correct?
Yes.
We'll be considering a recommendation calling for an audible and visual alarm system, which essentially would help alert folks to potential encroachment on a pipeline or other sort of critical infrastructure. And it seems clear for that sort of a alarm system to work that the location data has to be accurate and up to date. What's the current state of that sort of location information with respect to pipelines and high consequence areas and anchorage locations and other types of pertinent location data?
I should probably discuss how location data for pipelines gets onto nautical charts, and how that happens in the United States is as a function of the permitting Corps of Engineers permitting process for building a new pipeline or otherwise through a waterway. They are required to provide, once post-construction, the location data to NOAA Office of Coast Survey, who produces nautical charts for the United States. And so that's how that data gets onto the charts that mariners use. And that includes international ships, because that data is shared with international systems. As far as maintaining the accuracy of those pipelines, utilities, etc., NOAA told us that unless they are told otherwise, they're not resurveyed and recharted each, over a certain period. The location of a pipeline is assumed to be the same unless the operator tells NOAA otherwise. So is there a room for error there? Yes, although I would argue that there's not a lot of movement going on. A lot of times utilities are marked on a chart not as a singular line as it was with the San Pedro Bay pipeline, but as a corridor. And in that case, it's a lot wider. There's a lot more room for movement, that kind of thing, if it were to happen.
So conceding that these sorts of structures don't move much, nevertheless, occasionally, I assume there's construction or maintenance or that sort of thing that might result in movement. Is there any sort of an ongoing obligation on the part of an operator to report a change in location or some alteration of the physical location?
I am not aware of that. Ms. West, do you know? No.
As far as I know, they don't have to repeat when they send the initial plans to be identified in the charts. But there's no requirement if they make modifications to that, as far as I know.
Yeah, interesting. Chair, that's all the questions I have in this area. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We will consider a recommendation on developing procedures for vessel traffic services to notify pipeline and utility operators following potential incursions on submerged pipelines and utilities within the VTS's area of responsibility. Is this something that we've discussed with the Coast Guard, and is it something that we think they're amenable to or currently considering?
I don't know if they're currently considering it. Go ahead, Morgan.
Yes, good morning, Chair. I have had an opportunity to talk to the Coast Guard about this case, and they generally, like Drew mentioned, they're starting to work on changes to the anchorage and looking at improvements to VTS, both locally there in Long Beach and also nationwide as a result of this incident. So they are looking at this and eagerly awaiting our report.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's all the questions I have for this round. But Member Landsberg, do you have additional questions? I couldn't remember.
No further questions, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, and I don't think I have any from members Graham and Chapman. So with that, we will move on to issue number 3, which is response by pipeline controllers to leak alarms. Yes, that is the third one. And we'll start with Member Landsberg.
Thank you, Chair. PHMSA cited Beta Pipeline. I think this is for you, Ms. West. saying they did not follow the regulations for pipeline operations or its own written procedures for dealing with alarms and subsequent emergency shutdown. It also appears that they didn't even comply with the normal shift change documentation or periodic training. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. Matter of fact,
On all points. On all points?
Yes, on all points. As a matter of fact, they issued an enforcement action back in April of this year that included a mention about their emergency shutdown, their isolation and drawdown procedures, also about their leak detection system. So they address many areas, as well as shift changes and their operating hours.
So my second question, how often did or does PHMSA conduct a compliance audit to verify that Beta was performing according to these requirements?
So PHMSA conducts investigations, in particular inspections on pipelines. And in this case, they had conducted over 5 inspections, including a specialized inspection of the drug and alcohol. They do have a method and determination as to when they should inspect an operator. I would confer to them about the timing on that, but they do a risk-based approach, looking at several items about the operator's company, as well as their operations, and how they set their inspection process.
So they are required to conduct regular audits or inspections?
Correct. But it's on a risk-based approach, so the timing may vary.
Okay. Do you think that was sufficient in this case? I mean, it seems like there was pretty widespread non-compliance by Beta.
What I can say is that, and again, we might refer to PHMSA, in the case of an incident, they look at the total system, whereas in an inspection, they may look at portions of the system, and eventually, over a period of time, look at the whole pipeline operations. But when it comes to, when it comes to an incident, then they may look at every detail of what happened in the accident and what violations exist. But they're better suited to answer that question in more detail.
Now, that seems like it's sort of locking the barn door after the horses escaped. But any other regulatory audits that are conducted to provide any outside oversight? Anybody else looking at these kinds of things?
Yes, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE, they have the authority to inspect and investigate on pipeline. Matter of fact, they have 2 areas based on their SEMS rule, or Safety Environmental Management System rules, that looks at both the operations of the offshore portion, but also managing the right-of-way, and they hold the permit for that area. So those conditions.
Okay. We mentioned something about the free water knockout tank and the fact that it had over 100 times the expected amount of water. How does that work in terms of, you have a tremendous anomaly here, and yet we had statements from the operators that they got spurious alarms all the time, which is, of course, the communications alarms, which is a very serious problem in other areas. False alarms build a sense of complacency, and nobody seemed to do anything about it. So when there really was a problem, nobody really understood what was going on. Can you address those? And I apologize, Chair, for asking it right at the end of my round here, but.
So I can't speak for what they were thinking, but I can say that what they discovered is the leak detection system was showing a mile 0. For them, that would indicate that it was at the platform and not on the main pipeline. So they did checks. They had previous false alarms that they had contended with, and also the large amount of water that was coming through the system. So they also identified slack line conditions, which told him in the past there were false alarms. When they started up and shut down the pipeline, it also, they understood to indicate false alarms. They also experienced lost communication, which also indicated that there were leak alarms. So there's a number of things that led them to believe that there were false alarms, but also what they knew about the pipeline itself. They had the pipeline they knew to be in good condition. It had been over 40 years since they had a leak on the system. They've operated for over 40 years and never had a leak on the system. It also was maintained and was regularly cleaned. They did inspections on the line. They were operating below their maximum operating pressure. They also knew that there was no corrosion on the system. So this led them to believe that there was perhaps the equipment or false alarms that they're receiving versus the leak.
Yeah, that would seem like something worthy of a little more review, because if you've got a system that's operating very, very well, but you're constantly being warned that it's not operating correctly, it defeats the whole purpose of having a warning system. And I'm curious if any thoughts have been given to, hey, if these alarm systems are so prone to giving false alarms, maybe we need some better technology.
As a matter of fact, that's what the company did. So post-accident, they made some significant changes to their equipment and their operations and the procedures.
Understand. Chair, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I was reading through the report, and I think you had this in the presentation here. And this kind of bothered me. It says the day shift controller told the NTSB when the leak alarm activated at 16:10, and that would be on October 1st, the first alarm, he assumed he had received false indications from the equipment. He told investigators he was thinking that it was just a regular loss of communication, and it didn't really dawn on me that it was actually a leak because it happens to us all the time. Is the leak alarm and the loss of communication, this alarm, the same alarm? Is it the same sound? Is it the same indication? That's my question.
And that is a good question. And we went back and we discussed this at length. And we went back to the operator and asked them, how is it that the controllers coordinated or collaborated those two alarms? What was their understanding or thinking behind that? And they told us that there was no technical reason for those two alarms to coordinate. And in our investigation, we looked at this matter as well, and we didn't see a collaboration between those two alarms and why they're occurring.
So yeah, I think I read that you found no correlation between the two alarms. So that's just kind of confusing. So the next question is, did the controllers undergo any formal training on the leak detection system?
Prior to the accident, they had not.
They had not.
We had discovered they had not.
Well, that kind of makes sense of why they thought it was a different alarm or something. In general, on this pipeline, and I know some of this is proprietary and everything, but can you speak to, on this pipeline, how they determine they have a leak and how they determine where the leak location is?
That is a very good question that we went back and talked to the operator about that. In general terms, the pipeline will look at the pressures and flow rates at both ends of the line and do a balance between the two systems. However, the details of how that leak detection works, as you mentioned, is proprietary, but it does indicate, it's supposed to indicate where it is on the line, whether it's at the beginning of the line or somewhere in the middle, based on those parameters.
So in general, they have sensors at the beginning of the pipeline and at the end. They don't on the pipeline in between. So they have to use some kind of algorithms and things like that to determine the location. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And also it's better if, of course, if there's more sensors in the middle to accurately identify. But the way this system works is it at each end of the line.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. That's all the questions I have in this section. Thanks.
Thank you. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. Can I please ask that you provide just a brief description of the operator's procedure for responding to a crude oil leak?
Yes. Basically, the operator is supposed to identify if they identify a leak or have an indication of a leak, they're supposed to shut down the pipeline and isolate it and consider doing a drawdown.
And is that a procedure? And I'm sure it's that sounds relatively simple. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but is this a procedure that's prescribed by PHMSA regulation?
PHMSA doesn't specifically describe how they should conduct their emergency shutdowns or isolation or drawdown. However, they do have requirements for them to have procedures that identify how an operator should conduct these actions.
Okay,
Go ahead.
So the specific procedures will be determined by the operator and might depend on circumstances that are unique to that particular pipeline, correct?
Correct. And part of that, the procedure identification is that PHMSA will do an inspection to identify whether that procedure matches their operation and is detailed enough.
Okay. It's my understanding, and this is well before my time, but it's my understanding that PHMSA made significant changes in control room management requirements in response to an NTSB safety recommendation issued in 2005. Is that correct? And if it is, and if you're familiar with the details of it, could you describe, at least in general terms, what those requirements are, the control room management requirements?
Yes, at a recommendation based on the NTSB, the PHMSA went out and changed the control room management regulations. And now, I don't have all the details in front of me, but it has requirements for fatigue management, for drug and alcohol. It has requirements for the training as well as the operations in the control room and having procedures.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, it's my understanding the pipeline operator in this case was not in compliance, or at least was not in full compliance with these requirements, and especially with respect to training. Based on our investigation, are we able to assess whether the crude oil release might have been substantially mitigated had the operator complied with, for example, training requirements?
I would say that's yes. There's one of the requirements that PHMSA had identified in their enforcement is the training of the operator. There were 5 years that they went without training. That was addressed in that enforcement. But also part of that enforcement was looking at whether the operators were trained through simulation or team training. That way they can identify low probability but high consequence events that they would train together as a group. They also identified there was no formal leak detection system training that the operators received. So as a result, they wouldn't have working knowledge of the pipeline system as a team.
Yeah,
But
so
also,
go ahead.
It would also allow operators to understand how to safely operate in those types of events.
Yeah, so the whole point of training, these sorts of events don't happen every day, obviously, and fortunately. So the whole point of training is to make sure that there is some experience and knowledge, or there's a base of experience and knowledge on which operators can rely to respond when something unusual like this does occur. So that lack of training is really quite important, and it's critical and likely could have impacted the outcome of this particular accident. Chair, that concludes my questions for this round. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman, or Member Chapman. Sorry, Ms. West. A lot of my questions will be for you, but first, I want to talk about what was going on at the time, just sort of to reinforce what was going on when right before the first leak alarm went off, and then throughout the day. First, we have the situation with the water in the pipeline, right? And so that was resolved maybe 10 minutes before. Is that right? 10 minutes before the first leak alarm went off. So we have a pretty abnormal condition that they're already dealing with. And just to emphasize, I mean, we're talking 5 personnel here, 3 of which were on duty here, 1 of which was across a bridge on a different platform, but 2 on platform Ellie, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you had the situation of the abnormal operating condition already with the free water tank, and then you had multiple communications loss alarms that were going on throughout the day, which seems to be something that was a regular occurrence, given the pipeline controller's responses to us during questioning, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so, you know, and then you have the wrong location, you know, and I do have a question on I'm actually going to go back and ask a question on that alarm again, because I had the same question as Member Graham. I thought it was an excellent question. I know you said they don't correlate, the 2 alarms, but what specifically is the difference between the 2 alarms? Do we know? The communication
Yes.
loss and the leak detection alarm.
So communication loss alarm means there's a disconnection between the communication from one location to another.
I think what I mean here is sound, like the oral alert, the location, the visual alert. What's the difference there?
I was just going to briefly describe why the systems are different. For a leak detection alarm, it's looking for specific information from field units. When it doesn't get that alarm coming from the field unit, or it has an inadequate alarm coming back and signal coming back to the SCADA system, the leak detection system is looking for specific information. And when it doesn't get it, it gets an alarm. If you're getting communication to the SCADA system directly, there's no communication, then that's a different alarm. There's a loss of the signal that goes between the 2 locations. So they are somewhat separate systems in that the leak detection alarms are looking for information specific so it can do the algorithms, versus the loss communication, which is the connection between the SCADA and the 2 locations.
What does the controller see when and hear when a communications loss alarm comes across versus a leak detection alarm?
So what we found during the investigation is that the alarms look similar. There's an audible and invisible alarm that goes off on the console. And according to the in interviews with the controllers, that audible alarm is extremely loud.
So similar.
Similar.
Would it be difficult right now if someone was sitting here, if I was in with a pipeline controller and there were the 2 alarms, would you be able to tell the difference with or without training? Do they sound pretty much the same, look essentially the same?
I was going to mention that we didn't visit the control room, so we couldn't hear what the alarms look like. But from the description that the controllers mentioned, the alarms sounded the same and looked the same, other than what you can visually see and identify.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to this. There was the reason why I was asking this. And, you know I have a minute left. I have other questions in this. But before that concludes, I want to ask about the emergency shutdown, isolation, and drawdown procedures that were in place before today. Before our investigation. Page 1 says, in the event of an indicated or suspect pipeline leak, the San Pedro Bay pipeline is to be isolated by closing shutdown valve, and it keeps going on. My question is on the words, in the event of an indicated or suspect pipeline leak, because I think a lot of people would say, well, there were instructions there, but from my reading, it seems that they did not suspect there was a pipeline leak, that they felt it wasn't indicated. Is that correct?
Based on what we observed about the conditions, it would appear that they didn't suspect or indicate a leak. They again believed that they were having false alarms and didn't relate it back to a leak.
Mr. Eilers, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I would say that they didn't believe there was an indication. The system indicated a leak. So there was an indication, but they believed it was a false indication.
Great. And I'm going to come back on this in a second. I see I've run out of time. So Member Landsberg?
No further questions for this round, Chair. Thank you.
Great. Member Chapman? I'm sorry, Member Graham. Sorry about that.
No further questions from me. Thank you.
Apologize for that, Member Graham. Member Chapman?
And likewise for me, no further questions.
Okay. Can you put on the 5 minutes online? Continuing on along these lines, I was reading the notice of probable violation, proposed civil penalty, and proposed compliance order that PHMSA issued on April 6, 2023. And within it, it says, and I'm just closing up just what we talked about. During the NTSB interviews, both controllers on duty during the failure event stated that they were never trained on the Atmos leak detection system at all. This is corroborated by the lack of records maintained by Beta Offshore, demonstrating that for the past 5 years, controllers were, they claim, were trained to recognize leaks, but that did not happen. Despite Beta Offshore's written procedures that required this training, its controllers were not trained on these topics, as evidenced by their actions during the failure event. For example, during the failure, controllers continually shut the shipping pumps on and off in an effort to clear the alarms without performing additional actions to investigate the cause of the leak alarms. And during the NTSB interviews, the night shift controller stated that controllers have been taught this practice and that he has done it many times before. So I just want to talk about sort of what was going on. That does not excuse not following procedures, but it is very confusing. And this is what I actually want to talk about. We did actually, Rob Malloy, I'll give him credit. Rob Malloy did an excellent SCADA report in 2005, which I have quoted many times in my life, including when I was on the Hill. And prior to that, about 5 years prior to that, the NTSB had a 2-day hearing on pipeline safety, also, which coincidentally I was at. So this is not a new issue to the NTSB of rupture occurs, alarms are going off, controllers are trying to figure out what's going on, and over a period of time, more oil is released, the pipeline is not shut down, and again, they're trying to figure out what's going on. I'm just going to briefly, this was discussed in 2000 at the 2-day hearing, but in the SCADA system report, we mention a ton of accidents we've investigated. Brenham, Texas, 1992, Gramercy, Louisiana, 1996, Fork Shoals, South Carolina, 1996, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, 1996. Bellingham, Washington, 1999, where 2 young men died while fishing. Kids. Winchester, Kentucky, 2000. Greenville, Texas, 2000. Chalk Point, Maryland, 2000. Kingman, Kansas, 2004. And in the one that is most memorable for me, of course, occurred a few years later in 2009, and that was in Marshall, Michigan, when the pipeline ruptured and continued to flow for 17 straight hours before Enbridge realized there was a rupture. And the only reason they did realize it is because outside callers had called 911 to report that there was oil present. Throughout the 17 hours, the controllers had shut down and restarted the pipeline at least twice. And what we said as a result of that investigation in our probable cause was inadequate training of control center personnel, which allowed the rupture to remain undetected for 17 hours and through 2 startups of the pipeline was part of the probable cause. I think I'm running out of time again. Where am I on that? Okay, I've got 1 more minute here. So this is not a new issue. A couple of things I want to ask about, because it's not complacency. This is not an issue of complacency with pipeline controllers. There is a bit of desensitization to alarms, and there's some assumptions. These controllers were actively, even while fatigued. I will note that we'll talk about fatigue next. These were controllers who were experienced and actively looking for what was going on with their pipeline over the course of 14 hours. But I do want to ask about desensitization because in our 2005 study, we talk about that. And we talk about fatigue. It's not just at the time we stated it's not to say that in some cases those frequent alarms aren't meaningful. This was from a hearing witness in 2000 and shouldn't be acted upon. But I think when you combine the fatigue, familiarity with the system, and maybe desensitization, things tend to get missed and they tend not to believe them when they see them until they are seeing them repetitively. And so I'm at 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask if members have other questions, but kind of sounds familiar to me. I read this back from a testimony in 2000 and think about today. So let me ask Member Landsberg, do you have questions?
No further questions. And Chair, I just want to comment, you're on a roll here, but this gets into the normalization of deviance and not training people properly. This is not our first rodeo in this area.
Well, Bruce, I'm going to say this is your, we'll get to this later. This is your last board meeting. So let's talk about that because I'm going to also talk about aviation. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well,
this is your 5 minutes.
I was trying to keep us a little on track here, but the whole business of alarms and in aircraft, they're critical as they are in other modes of transportation. But in aviation, we frequently have less time to deal with things. And so there's been a great deal of effort put into trying to make sure that crew members or individual pilots understand when an alarm is going off that something needs to be done. And even if it's considered spurious, which happens occasionally, even if it's considered a false alarm, you don't just blow it off. You take corrective action, even though it may mean landing short or doing something completely different than completing the flight as planned. So it's a completely different culture than what we're seeing here in the pipeline industry. And I find that a bit troubling. And if the alarms are constantly having problems, then that tells me that they're not serving their function because they're desensitizing the pipeline controllers to what's going on. It's a false alarm. And in aviation, we looked at this a long time ago and said, no, this is unacceptable. And we've got to work on it. A, fix the technology and the alarm problem. And then secondly, if you get an alarm, you think it's false, still don't ignore it. Go ahead and take corrective action, even though it may be inconvenient or expensive.
Thank you. And I know Mr. Ehlers is wanting to make a comment. I can see it. And so is Ms. West. Don't worry, we're going to get back to what happened here. But first, Member Landsberg, did you have additional questions in this area?
I have no further comments, Chair. Thank you.
Member Graham.
No further questions from me. Thank you.
Member Chapman.
None from me. Thanks.
Great. So I here clearly, there was some lack of training, and these personnel were trying to figure out what was going on, whether it was in accordance with procedures or not. There are still procedures you need to follow, and In this situation, different procedures were followed that were really for a communication loss event. The manual calculation that they did to determine a leak. But I do think I want to get back to this question of the difference in the alarms, because I do think that is something, and we have seen this in aviation. And in fact, we note it in our 2005 safety study, where we talk about the human factors design standard produced by the FAA, which states that alarms should be automatically organized and presented to the users in a prioritized manner. Alarms that would indicate an immediate action, such as indicators of potential product loss, should override all alarms and require immediate action by a controller. And this is really talking about the prioritization of the alarms, but having alarms that essentially sound the same and maybe look the same isn't great. So, I mean, I'm hoping that Beta Offshore is changing that. I'm sure it is pretty prevalent in the pipeline industry, but do we know if they're making any changes to that? I know that our report said they invested in this substantially before the accident occurred, so it would be interesting to know what they did to change and if they have future plans, or if they did change it to make sure the alarms are differentiated.
I can answer that and just say that we didn't observe where that change was made, but it's something that we can look into in more detail, because they did make infrastructure changes, but a lot of that had to do with the communication system. But the console will have to look at what changes were made to specifically identify the alarms. There were a lot of alarms that went off that day, not specific to the pipeline, but other activities as well.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ehlers, did you, and Ehlers?
No, I've just, Ms. West answered the question.
Okay, great. I would just end that part by saying, and I quote her a lot, Nancy Levison from MIT. She says, human error is a symptom of a system that needs to be redesigned. I could not agree more. I have one other question, or two other questions. Difference between integrity management and safety management systems. I think Ms. Lyons was probably prepared to answer that question, hopefully.
Sure. So I can start an answer to it. A couple years ago, I was assigned to follow pipeline safety management systems for the NTSB. And one of the things I did early on was do a comparison between what are the regulatory requirements and where does PSMS pick up kind of the gaps. And when pipeline operators implement a PSMS program, that's one of their first steps as well, because there is overlap. I think Kim may have mentioned this also earlier. A lot of the regulatory requirements do match up with PSMS, and so they can credit where they're already meeting some of those goals. And integrity management, that would be true for those regulatory requirements as well. They are broad, but over time, I guess there's two things that I would say. One is the integrity management requirements don't apply to all areas of pipeline systems. So that's one place that PSMS would pick up that gap. And through the recommended practice, the operator would address the threats there more than, to a higher level than what the regulations require. And then the other thing is, even though the regulation for integrity management is fairly broad, the regulatory precedent kind of establishes what is acceptable as far as meeting the regulation, where the PSMS as a right now voluntary program is wouldn't be setting that kind of precedent. It would be pushing the operator and their staff to improve their safety culture, to be more proactive as they go about implementing their safety program. And we've seen a lot of operators are doing that voluntarily and having good success with voluntary implementation.
Yeah, and I have to give the American Petroleum Institute a lot of credit, because our first recommendation on pipeline safety management systems came out of Marshall. and they exceeded our recommendation, developed an industry standard, which is very robust. And now, a lot of operators have adopted SMS, and we're encouraging others to also adopt SMS, as are they. So appreciate that. Those are the end of my questions for this round, just making sure others don't also have questions. Okay, so we will move on to issue number 4, which is issues related to alcohol and other drug testing, as well as fatigue, starting with Member Landsberg.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a rhetorical question, but I want to ask it anyway. Are there any regulatory requirements concerning shift time and the amount of recovery time between when people are on duty for these pipeline controllers?
Yes, there is. PHMSA has requirements in their regulations that requires, under the control room management, that identifies in not in a prescriptive way, but it describes what the requirements are for a program.
Okay, and as I understand it, the day shift controller did not comply with those requirements. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, a couple of reasons. He had very little sleep because before he was coming on his shift, he had less than 5 hours of sleep, and then went on to another shift. The reason he had to take another shift is another controller wasn't able to get to the platform. So he had to assume his shift, forcing him to do extra hours.
Why wasn't the other controller able to get to the platform?
I believe there was problems with not just traffic. I believe there was a problem onshore that was preventing him to get through to the platform.
How many controllers did they have in total that could perform this duty at Beta?
I can't explain.
How many controllers were assigned as the staff for supporting monitoring the pipeline? And I assume there's one person on duty 24 hours, 7 days a week. How many people do they have that support that function?
I should say they do a 12-hour shift. So they have to have enough staff to cover those shifts and extra. I believe there were 5 controllers.
At the time of the accident, I think I understand your question. At the time of the accident, they had 2 controllers who were alternating back.
Yeah, thank you, Captain Ehlers. That, I think, is my concern, is they were understaffed in terms of this. And so there was absolutely no margin. If somebody got sick or there was an accident, onshore traffic, et cetera, they had no margin whatsoever, in which case they're now stretching their people beyond both what is legal, but what's reasonable. And that's a concern for me. And I hope that Beta addresses this, because it's just not fair to have the controllers on duty for that period of time. Again, I go back to aviation. We see this, and we have very stringent rules. And in fact, we're suffering right now with some challenges in that area, in the air traffic area. So, Chair, I don't really have any further questions in this area, but this is a concern for me.
Thank you so much. Member Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Let me just tag on what Member Landsberg's asking. Did the investigation consider whether Beta was appropriately staffed for the tasks that they were required to perform on the platform?
I think here, if I can jump in here, we did look at the staffing, and it didn't. I'd say this is our determination was it wasn't the accident wasn't a result of inappropriate staffing, even though as we determined, or as we propose in our draft report, even though the daytime operator was likely impacted by acute fatigue. At the time of the leak, the nighttime controller was there with him, and they were making decisions as a group, and then he soon thereafter went off watch. So we didn't determine that staffing issues were directly an impact to this accident. Having said that, I do know that Beta has increased, at least on a temporary basis, their manning to 3 watchstanders, 3 controllers on a trial basis, and they will reassess that after, I believe, a 3-year period.
Okay. Looking at PHMSA's proposed compliance order, what will be required of Beta to do to improve fatigue management?
Let me address that real quick. I was going to say they have addressed the issue through their enforcement, and as a result, they will have to change their procedures to ensure that their controllers are getting the mandated 8 hours rest. It is in their procedures currently, but they'll have to re-emphasize and retrain their staff on fatigue management as well as their managers.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Now, the pipeline controllers on duty were not tested for drugs or alcohol following the oil release discovery. Were they required to be tested?
Based on what we observed, they would have been required to test. However, they did not test their controllers.
They did not test them. After this incident, what actions have Beta or PHMSA taken to improve Beta's alcohol and drug testing program?
I should mention that in their enforcement action I mentioned earlier in April, they did not address the drug and alcohol. However, since then, we've had conversations with PHMSA about their drug and alcohol and their enforcement actions, and they're having discussions with the operator and looking at future inspections and reviews of their system.
Yeah. So initially I saw nothing there, and I'm very concerned about that, but it's good to hear that they're reconsidering that. So thank you. That's all the questions I have in this section.
Thank you, Member Chapman.
There we go. Just trying to push the right buttons here. Picking up on the questions regarding drug testing, I fully support the proposed recommendation calling on PHMSA to audit the pipeline operators' drug testing program to ensure compliance with the post-accident drug testing regulations. Do we know? I'm guessing that the answer to this question is that there weren't any, but do we know whether there were other accidents involving this operator in which post-accident drug testing might have been required but wasn't conducted?
In our review of the previous inspections, there was no indication that there was another violation, that they had failed to do so.
And do we know whether PHMSA is aware of the extent to which this issue, that is lack of compliance with drug testing requirements, the extent to which that issue might be prevalent among other pipeline operators?
I would say yes. In a previous accident, NTSB had investigated in San Bruno. This is back in 2010. At that time, they identified something very similar in that their controllers were not tested for drugs and alcohol at that time. And this was of great concern. And at that time, the regulations had too much discretion for the operator. It was based on, the operators looked at it and said, based on their best available information, they did not drug test their folks. However, what we found out in that investigation, which directly related to this, is that the controllers had direct involvement in monitoring and controlling the pipeline. They should have tested, but they didn't. And similar to this situation where they do have direct involvement in the control of the pipeline or the alarms and the events of the day. And they should have also been instructed to test as well.
So when you say the answer is yes, does that mean that this is a problem that's prevalent and that PHMSA is aware of it?
What I was referring to is that PHMSA is aware,
Is aware?
based on previous incidents, that
Okay.
this is a problem for the review and understanding of what the requirements are fully for the drug and alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like maybe there's a need for PHMSA to clarify or reinforce the importance of this. And I would hope maybe the agency would do so in the wake of this particular accident. I want to shift to, I'll call this the other issues category. This is not related to the drug testing or fatigue. This is just an area I wanted to ask about. During our discussions with all of you prior to the board meeting, I came to understand that NTSB investigated 2 other anchor draggings resulting in pipeline strikes in the past 20 years. But apparently these incidents were not cited in the draft report because I'm told the circumstances of those accidents were different and didn't support the findings and recommendations in this report. Just for purposes of awareness, would you please briefly describe those 2 other incidents and how they were different from this particular accident?
Sure. The first incident occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. A vessel lost engine power and dropped its anchor. It was not near an anchorage. It wasn't in a anchorage position. It was actually out in the Gulf of Mexico. It subsequently dragged anchor and struck a pipeline that serviced, I believe, a natural gas platform out in the Gulf. So it was an emergency anchorage, not a designated anchorage like we had in San Pedro Bay, and it was not in a port as we see here. So that was that accident. The other accident occurred in the Great Lakes, up in Lake Michigan. A vessel unknowingly dropped its anchor while it was underway and continued to operate, continued to move. It was en route to its destination and did not discover that the anchor had dropped for several hours, if not a couple of days. Anyway, during the time that anchor was trailing underneath the vessel, it crossed a pipeline and struck the pipeline. So again, not related to a designated anchorage, not related to an anchored vessel. In that case, it was a vessel that was underway and had essentially lost its anchor, or at least lost control of its anchor. So that's why these 2 situations were different.
That's helpful. Thank you. I have no further questions. Thanks to all of you for your answers today.
Thank you. I have a question on shift lengths. So the control room management regulations certainly have the establishment of off-duty time for 8 hours of continuous sleep, but there is also an allowance for an emergency deviation from that, correct?
That's correct, according to the regulation. I'm sorry.
Okay.
According to
So
the procedures.
Yeah, so then they could essentially work up to 18 hours with a 10-hour off-duty time.
That's correct.
In this case, I just want to reinforce that the day shift controller was working for 22.5 hours from 4:30 a.m. on Thursday, September 30th of 2021 to 2 a.m. on Friday of October 1st. And my only question there, yes, PHMSA did propose civil penalties for that. But my only question for that is if anyone can talk about how fatigue affects how you react and respond to things. I mean, certainly there were that may not have been a factor here, but I'm just generally, we know fatigue is an issue in pipeline operations. So just wondering if you could address that. And that's my last question.
Okay.
I can address this. And the reason I can address this is this isn't just a pipeline issue, as you're well aware. It's a nautical issue. It's a aviation issue. But the effects of fatigue, whether it's acute fatigue or chronic fatigue, are slower reaction times, poor decision making, and those are the key ones when you're an operator, particularly in emergency situations. So those are critical, and those are when we see fatigue as a reason. Those are generally the reasons.
Great, thank you very much. I will ask Member Landsberg, do you have any other questions?
No further questions, Chair. Thank you.
Member Graham.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I do have one question here. On the day of the gale warning, I know the VTS station there, LA Long Beach, their watch standards were dealing with, I think it says here, exceptionally high vessel activity due to the weather. Did the investigation consider whether the VTS station was appropriately staffed for the tasks that were required on that day, and whether that was a factor in the accident?
Yes, we did. And just for the benefit of all, I'll explain what their staffing was. The VTS at any one time had 3 personnel on duty. 2 personnel, 1 person was the controller. That is the person that was monitoring the vessel monitoring system and also speaking or conducting radio communications with vessels via VHF radio. A second watchstander was what they called the desk watchstander. It was a person that was monitoring their computer information system and also answering phones. The third was a person that was on break, and they rotate about every 2 hours. And that person on break, if there was a critical situation, could be brought off break and to assist the controller and the desk watch officer. So those are the watch standards. So when we looked at the situation on January 25th, we listened to their radio communications, looked at the actions they took, and nothing suggested that they were overtasked. They were certainly busy, but they responded to all radio calls immediately. They clearly were monitoring the situation, and during that morning, 2 other vessels that dragged anchor collided. Completely separate accident happened on the same day, and they called the on-break person up to assist them. So we didn't see any issue with work overload or task overload. What we really believe is the issue and why they didn't recognize the danger of the San Pedro Bay pipeline was that they just didn't have the appropriate tools, and that was the overlay, which they've since added onto their system, and also the recommended alarm system that we have proposed.
Great. Thank you for that, Mr. Ehlers, and thank you, Ms. West. Chair, I have no further questions.
Nope. Thank you very much. Member Chapman.
No further questions, Chair. Thank you.
All right. I also have no further questions. And so we're going to take a break. We are going to break until 12:15. And I just would remind everyone to turn off your cameras and turn off your microphone, and we will reconvene again at 12:15. Thank you so much to all of you for providing excellent answers to our questions. All right, we're back, and the board is now going to move to consideration of the proposed findings, the proposed probable cause, the proposed recommendations, and then the entire report. So we will start with Mr. Curtis reading the proposed findings.
Certainly, Chair. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 16 findings. Number 1, none of the following issues contributed to the pipeline leak. 1, pipeline as manufactured material condition. 2, pipeline overpressurization. 3, experience and qualifications of the vessel's crews and VTS personnel. Or 4, fatigue of vessel crews and VTS watch standards. Number 2, although there were no indications of alcohol or other drug use by the pipeline controllers on duty at the time of the crude oil release, or Beijing and MS Danet crew members on duty at the time of the anchor draggings, evidence was insufficient to determine whether alcohol or other drug use contributed to the pipeline leak and severity of the accident. Number 3, the release of crude oil occurred as a result of fatigue failure that manifested over a period of time in an area of local deformation to the San Pedro Bay pipeline, caused by an external force applied to the pipeline that resulted in progressive cracks initiated and growing through the pipe wall until the pipe wall ruptured. Number 4, as a result of the winds and seas generated by a strong cold front, the container ships Beijing and MSC Danet dragged anchor, and the anchors struck, displaced, and damaged the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Number 5, although both ships' anchors struck, damaged, and displaced the pipeline, the MSC Danet anchor's contact with the San Pedro Bay pipeline was the initiating event that led to the eventual crude oil release. Number 6, because of the proximity of anchorage positions to the pipeline, the crews of the Beijing and MSC Danet had insufficient time and space to heave in their dragging anchors in high winds and seas before the anchors contacted the pipeline. Number 7, the southeast boundary of anchorage F and the location of contingency anchorage positions southwest of anchorage F did not leave a sufficient margin of safety between anchored vessels and the San Pedro Bay pipeline. Number 8, had the pipeline operator been made aware of the Beijing and MSC Danet anchor dragging, the company could have conducted an underwater survey of the pipeline, identified the damage, and made repairs, preventing the eventual release of crude oil. Number 9, due to the absence of a visual indicator of the San Pedro Bay pipeline on the Vessel Traffic Service, VTS, Los Angeles Long Beach Vessel Monitoring System, and exceptionally high vessel activity occurring in the anchorage due to the weather, the VTS watch standards did not recognize the danger presented to the San Pedro Bay pipeline by the Beijing and MSC Danet dragging anchors. Number 10, an audible and visual alarm on the Vessel Traffic Service Los Angeles Long Beach Vessel Monitoring System that alerts when an anchored vessel is encroaching on a pipeline would improve watchstander awareness of the possibility of an anchor strike in the San Pedro Bay anchorages. Number 11, defined procedures for informing pipeline and other utility operators when possible incursions have occurred within the Vessel Traffic Service area of responsibility would improve the pipeline or utility operator's ability to identify and respond to any damage. Number 12, abnormal operating conditions such as water buildup in the pipeline and incorrect leak location indicated by the leak detection system and frequent previous communication loss alarms contributed to the pipeline controller's incorrect determination that the leak alarms were false. Number 13, had the San Pedro Bay pipeline controllers responded in accordance with company procedure for a leak by shutting down and isolating their pipeline, they would have significantly reduced the volume of crude oil released and the resulting environmental damage. Number 14, the insufficient training of the pipeline controllers contributed to the 14-hour delay in stopping the pipeline's shipping pumps and the increased volume of crude oil released following the first leak alarm. Number 15, although the day shift pipeline controller was likely affected by the adverse performance effects of acute fatigue, the incorrect response and assessment of the leak alarms was due to insufficient training of the day shift pipeline controller and night shift pipeline controller. And number 16, Beta Offshore was not in compliance with regulations when the company did not drug test the pipeline controllers following the accident. Chair?
Thank you very much. Are there any amendments to the findings? Oh, actually, let me do a roll call first. Bring up Member Landsberg, Member Graham, and Member Chapman. All right. Wonderful. So are there any amendments to the proposed findings? No? Okay. Is there a motion to adopt and a second?
So moved.
Second.
Wonderful. All right. So then motion to adopt offered by Member Landsberg, second by Member Graham, and I'll call on council to call the roll.
Okay, board, good afternoon. As I call each of your names, if in favor, say aye. If opposed, say nay. Start with Member Landsberg,
Aye.
Member Graham,
Aye.
Member Chapman,
Aye.
and Chair Homendy.
Aye.
Okay, Chair, the vote tallies 4 in favor of adopting the findings as presented.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Curtis, feel free to read through the proposed probable cause.
Chair, staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the damage to and subsequent crude oil release from the San Pedro Bay pipeline was the proximity of established anchorage positions to the pipeline, which resulted in 2 container ships' anchors striking the pipeline when the ships dragged anchor in high winds and seas. Contributing to the crude oil release was the undetected damage to the pipeline, which allowed fatigue cracks to initiate and grow to a critical size in the pipeline to leak nearly 9 months later. Contributing to the amount of crude oil released was the pipeline controllers not shutting down and isolating the pipeline in response to a leak alarm as required by company procedure. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis. I have an amendment to the probable cause, but do other members have an amendment to the probable cause? Nope. Okay, so I will offer an amendment by striking lines 17 through 19 on page 128, which currently reads, contributing to the amount of crude oil released was the pipeline controllers not shutting down and isolating the pipeline in response to a leak alarm as required by company procedure. I would strike these lines and insert the following. Contributing to the amount of crude oil released was the failure of Beta Offshore to sufficiently train its pipeline controllers to react and appropriately respond to leak alarms and shut down and isolate the pipeline. Contributing to the pipeline controller's inappropriate response to the leak alarms was the water buildup in the pipeline, an incorrect leak location indicated by Beta Offshore's leak detection system, and frequent previous communication loss alarms. Is there a second for my amendment?
I'll second it for discussion.
Sure. Thank you very much. And we'll begin discussion on the amendment. We have investigated a number of pipeline releases, as I mentioned during the discussion, over the years where alarms and pipeline controllers did not identify a rupture and shut down the pipeline, sometimes in hours. And in those cases, in many of those cases, we cited a lack of training. In this particular incident, there was a lot going on prior to the first leak alarm, about 10 minutes prior. And we have a lot of evidence showing that the controllers were not appropriately trained. So in crafting this amendment with staff, we combined language from finding number 12 and page 117 for the last contributing clause, And for the first one, using language from a combination of the current probable cause and page 119. So happy to have discussion on the amendment.
I'd like to hear staff's response to this.
Yes, good afternoon. And I would like to have proposed maybe just a quick 5 minutes for staff to confer on this. Generally speaking, the conversation we had today is very instructive. We believe training is a critical part of this incident. In fact, there are 2 findings related to it. I would just like to have staff to briefly confer and get back to you, maybe 5 minutes, Chair, if that's all right.
Yes, I would note we had a very lengthy discussion for hours yesterday.
Yes.
So if there
No,
was a
we're prepared.
concern, I would suspect that you would have brought it up for hours yesterday.
You know, we're prepared to move forward quickly on this, Chair. I just want to confer. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay. As you mentioned, we did have a chance to confer and consider this. I just spoke to the Deputy Director there, Mike Hiller, and myself, and we both concur that this change the probable cause is appropriate, and we agree completely.
Okay, great. Any other further discussion? Okay, all right. So I offered an amendment, and Member Landsberg, I believe, seconded it for discussion. And so our General Counsel, Mr. McMurray.
Yes, Chair. Thank you. Board, once again, if in favor of the amended probable cause statement, please say aye. If opposed, say nay. Member Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And Chair Homendy.
Aye.
All right, Chair, the vote tally is 4 in favor of adopting the proposed probable cause statement as amended by your amendment.
Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Curtis, you may read the recommendations, proposed recommendations.
All right.
Oh,
Chair.
whoa, actually, we cannot. I think we'll have to go back procedurally. I think that amendment, Eric just reminded me, was just to strike the last line. We still have to go back and support or vote in opposition or support of the entire probable cause. And so with that, I'll offer a motion to adopt the probable cause as amended.
So moved.
Mr. McMurray?
Second.
Oh, second. Yes.
Okay,
Clearly, I'm
thank
going to
you.
need some coffee soon.
On the probable cause statement as amended, if in favor, say aye. If opposed, say nay. Member Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And Chair Homendy.
Aye.
All right, so it's 4 in favor of adopting the probable cause statement as amended.
Thank you. Great catch, Eric. Now, Mr. Curtis can read the proposed recommendations.
Certainly, Chair. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 5 new safety recommendations, I'm sorry. 1 to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Number 1, audit Beta's offshore drug testing program to ensure compliance with post-accident drug testing regulations. 3 recommendations to the U.S. Coast Guard. Number 2, implement the proposed vessel traffic service Los Angeles Long Beach restructuring of the San Pedro Bay federal anchorages to increase the margin of safety between anchored vessels and pipelines in San Pedro Bay. Number 3, develop and implement the capability on all vessel traffic service VTS vessel monitoring systems nationwide to provide audible and visual alarms for VTS watchstanders when an anchored vessel is encroaching on a pipeline. Number 4, develop procedures for Vessel Traffic Services, VTS, to notify pipeline and utility operators following potential incursions on submerged pipelines and utilities within the VTS's area of responsibility. And one recommendation to the Marine Exchange of Southern California. Number 5, work with your vessel monitoring system provider to add audible and visual alarms to the system that alert the Vessel Traffic Service watchstander when an anchored vessel is encroaching on a pipeline. Chair.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And just checking, I have one amendment, but checking if there are additional amendments to the proposed recommendations. Making sure Member Chapman doesn't have another. Okay, great. So I am going to offer an amendment that states the following. To owners and operators of pipelines regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. The recommendation language is develop and implement a pipeline safety management system based on American Petroleum Institute recommended practice 1173.
Purposes of discussion, I will second.
Thank you very much, Member Landsberg. I should have thought about this when we were considering the draft that was circulated, but did not. I want to thank Tom for reminding me about SMS, because we have a long history with SMS, and I'm just referring to pipelines going back to the Marshall, Michigan pipeline rupture, which remains the largest inland oil pipeline rupture in the United States at nearly 1 million gallons of oil. As a result of that investigation, we recommended that API develop standards or recommended practice around pipeline safety management systems. They exceeded the recommendation and actually developed it after years of work within the gas and oil pipeline industry and working with PHMSA and the safety community to develop a I definitely do need coffee, but a robust recommendation that part of that recommendation is focused on scalability for all pipeline operators, big and small. The recommended practice is one that the industry is trying to get operators to adopt. It's still really in the early stages of pipeline operators adopting the recommended practice, but they have made a lot of headway, and they are in the process of educating both gas and pipeline operators on the benefits of adopting safety management systems. So I did reach out to LIPA, which is the oil pipeline industry, the hazardous pipeline industry, also to INGA. I did try to reach Pipeline Safety Trust, but it's early in the state of Washington, but I know that they also support SMS, and then reached out to the administrator of PHMSA. Everybody would like to see folks move forward with the recommended practice and implement SMS. And so we don't have a recommendation on the books recommending beyond just development of the standard. We don't have a recommendation for voluntary implementation to create a process where the operators would begin to implement SMS. Again, many of them have, but there's still some work to do. And at least AOPL, which is now known as LIPA, the liquid energy pipelines thinks it'd be very helpful in helping them get operators to adopt it. So happy to answer any questions. I will go ahead and ask Mike Hiller to pop on up because I did talk to him and Rob and Brian prior to circulating it. So I'll go ahead and ask the question now. Mike, where is staff on the recommendation?
Thank you, Chair. I have had an opportunity to communicate with staff, and as you well point out, 1173 points out that there are essential elements for successful SMS program. Within those elements, just competence, awareness, and training, risk management, and continuous improvement. All of these are areas, much like in Marshall, Michigan, that pipeline safety would be enhanced if pipeline companies implemented safety management systems. Staff is prepared to support this recommendation.
And one question I have before I call, I believe the lineup was Member Chapman, Member Landsberg, Member Graham. There's not a lot in the report on SMS, even though the investigative staff had looked at SMS. So this would require some additional work, even if adopted by staff, to circulate for approval among the members. Correct?
Correct, ma'am.
Okay, great. Member Chapman.
That actually was my first question, was whether we can incorporate sufficient support into the report. Sounds like we can. Look, I support substantively where we're trying to go with this. My question really has to do with kind of the angle at which we're coming from here. Why not make this a recommendation to PHMSA to require SMS of pipeline operators, rather than we're relying really here on voluntary compliance? Are we comfortable that the pipeline industry is sufficiently inclined to move on a voluntary basis without regulation?
I believe we are. Yes, I'm sorry, Chair.
No, that's okay. I was going to ask if you wanted to comment as well, and I'll turn back to you. So feel free to gather your thoughts on that. At this time, I would not support a regulation on this. First of all, it's going to take 8 years. Second of all, what we need right now, the pipeline industry is not where aviation is. They didn't have a voluntary program for a while to begin to create those robust programs within the operators and to work with the smaller operators as well. And so that needs to happen. I think there would be significant pushback, and this would end up going nowhere, versus if this is actually something I brought up after the pipeline rupture in Boston on NiSource, and got significant pushback from staff, rightfully so. They were worried that if there was a requirement for PHMSA to issue a regulation, number one, it wouldn't get done. The industry would push back, and in the meantime, wait for a regulation that would take 8 years versus starting to implement a SMS program now. They would be worried, what would be the outcome? What would it look like? So we won't do anything. So I thought that really resonated to me at the time when we talked about it in 2018, 2019. And so, I think it still exists today now that we have a standard. I think, our hope is that they would move forward.
And Mr. Hiller, that's your view as well?
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you.
Member Landsberg, then to Member Graham.
Member Chapman has exactly asked the question I was going to ask, and I think that's a good answer. So I accept that. Thank you.
Member Graham.
Yeah, thanks. I got a couple questions. And I think this one's probably for Mr. Hiller to start. How many pipeline owner and operators are we talking about? Do we know that number?
I don't have the number, but if you just Trust me,
About
it's in the
1,000.
thousands.
About 1,000. Okay. Yeah, I know there's a lot of them out there. That's one of my concerns is with all the recommendation follow-ups and everything, do we have the resources to support this?
And I spoke to Ms. Catania on that, and perhaps she could come up and address this.
Hello, Chair. Yes, well, we do have limited resources right now, but we are trying to grow the team and the staff, and we were going to do our best to accommodate, make sure that we are timely and following up with all the recommendation recipients, just like we do with everything, that we send recommendations to. We're always trying to stay on top of it and do it as quickly as possible.
Okay, I'm an advocate for SMS, as you know. I ran my own. I developed my own in aviation. I'm all for SMS. I'm just concerned we have enough struggles when we do 50 state recommendations, 1,000 or so. That's a lot to handle. That's why I asked the question. Thank you.
I think it's a great question. Oh, this is technically still your time. Is it okay?
I'm good. That's all I got.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. We had concerns as well. My concern is I didn't want to limit it to just Amplify Energy. If we just issued it to the associations, we would miss Amplify Energy plus a number of organizations that are not part of those associations. So this was the best way that we could figure it out. And perhaps we can figure out a way forward on the recommendations recipient and issuance of letter side. But I do think it's important that we have a recommendation on the books for SMS for pipelines so we can begin to push action. And I think, in speaking with at least the oil pipeline industry, they would be very willing to work with us on trying to educate their members and others in the industry to get the word out on how important this is. If it's something we're interested in too, I would love to, I know that we have a lot of expertise on this board. Member Graham, you mentioned implementing that in another mode. Perhaps we can consider doing in addition to this, a roundtable to really push the issue. This is something we considered doing and actually planned for doing before the height of the pandemic and we all went home. So perhaps we can get that back on the books, and certainly would welcome your expertise in helping get the message across. All right. So we will go to a vote. If I could pull up Mr. McMurray. Thank you very much.
Yes, Chair, and consistent with recent past practice, we'll consider the amendment first and then all of the recommendations. So on the amendment, board members, I'll start with Landsberg again. Member Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And Chair Homendy.
Aye.
All right, Chair, the vote tally is obviously 4 in favor of adopting the proposed amendment. So we'll move on, if you're ready, to the remainder of the findings, recommendations.
Yes, and I just want to, process-wise, Mike, could you, Mr. Hiller, could you come up again? Because I know that you were part of another report previously where you had to put some language together in the report on what the investigators did and discovered on SMS for background. That'll get circulated to the board for review and approval, just like we normally do in PMA.
Yes, ma'am. Information item, a new section 2.7, discussion, a conclusion, and subsequent recommendations as just voted on.
Great.
Great.
All right, then on the amended recommendations, you're ready to vote, Chair? All right. Once again, aye if in favor and nay if opposed. Member Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
And Chair.
Aye.
All right, 4 in favor of adopting the proposed amended recommendations.
Great, thank you. So I It is now time to consider the entire report. Obviously, actually, Mr. McMurray, could you come up for a second? Procedurally, how would we do this? Because there's still a section of the report that we could, I don't know, you tell me. There's still a section of the report. I forget how we've done it in the past.
I would think that you could take care of that through the notation process instead of trying to vote at this point before the report is amended. So I would just recommend deferring that to the notation process.
Does that work for everyone here? Yep. Okay, great. Then we will defer final approval of the report until the notation process that'll go through normal electronic voting. And so we will move to reserving the right to file a concurring and dissenting statement, which may also depend on a review of the final language. So we could always take changes to that, but does anyone right now want to know that they want to file a concurring or dissenting statement? I'll reserve the right, but not sure I will do it. So I'll just reserve the right. But if anyone changes their mind later, fine with me. Okay, if I could take 1 second. So our deliberations have now concluded. I want to thank my fellow board members for their preparation and participation in today's meeting. We discussed topics that underscore the importance of this investigation and our safety recommendations. In particular, I would like to thank my colleague, and I will still call him Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg. And I want to, I do want to give members Graham and Chapman some time to thank him as well. We will not take time to publicly roast you here, but we will thank you. Bruce and I came to the board together in August of 2018. Our first public board meeting was the Air Canada overflight at SFO. Bruce, I just want to say I have always been impressed with your preparation for these board meetings, for your incredible dedication to safety, and most of all, for your heart. You have a big heart, Bruce, not just for those you advocate for, but for everyone around you. Thank you for all that you've done for safety and, of course, for this agency. And thank you for your steadfast leadership and your friendship. I'm positive that you will continue to play a big role in safety in all modes of transportation. I expect you to continue on distracted driving in particular. And I look forward to continuing to work with you in your new adventures. So I will ask Member Graham, do you wanna chime in at all?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't think we're finished with you yet, are we?
Definitely not.
No. Hey, I want to thank you for your service to aviation safety, but safety and national transportation safety for sure. And it's been an honor and a privilege to serve with you. It's unfortunate that most of it was not in person. But from a naval aviator to the Air Force, I wish you fair winds and following seas.
Very nice. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. I was giving serious thought to offering an amendment to reconsider the roasting part of your pledge there, but I'll withhold. Bruce, it's been a real honor to serve with you. This, of course, is our second opportunity to work together as colleagues, having both served at one of our mutual former employers. I've always enjoyed your thoughtfulness, and I think the chair summed it up. You have a wonderful attitude towards people, very accepting. Wish you all the very best. And again, it's just been an honor to serve with you.
Thank you all. I think I would have been more comfortable with the roast aspect of this. You're embarrassing me at no end. I will just say that it's been a great 5 years. I've enjoyed working with everybody most of the time, and I think the feeling would be mutual on that. We didn't always agree on things, but one of the best things about this board is that everybody is passionate about what we do, about saving lives, regardless of whichever mode is involved, and that's just essential. And to the staff, I would say across the board in all of the modes and in every support function, we couldn't do it without you. So thank you one and all, and guarantee. Now I'm going to have to go through the guard shack in order to get in to harass you personally, but I can do that. So thank you all very much for the opportunity.
Bruce, I'm pretty sure after 5 years you get to keep your badge, so just show it when you come up. All right, well, we will miss you, Bruce. And now we'd like to extend our gratitude to our colleagues in the Office of Marine Safety, the Office of Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Investigations, the Office of Research and Engineering, the Office of General Counsel, and of course, the Office of the Managing Director for their work over the course of this investigation and in the development of an excellent report. The board extends its appreciation to our colleagues in the Office of Human Resources, Career Development and Training, the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and the Digital Services Division for your vital support of this meeting. I'd also like to thank our Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. We all very much appreciate all that you do. Plus your diligent work and advocacy to improve safety, which will go well beyond today. And when acted upon, the recommendations we've issued and reiterated today will save lives. The NTSB looks forward to working with the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the United States Coast Guard, the Marine Exchange of Southern California to implement our recommendations, as well as the oil and gas pipeline operators and others that are regulated by PHMSA. So thank you very much, everyone. And with that, we stand adjourned and can go get coffee.